Chapter 644. I once traversed countless ice plains and witnessed the strength of life and the greatness of nature. I was also once intoxicated by the magnificence of glaciers, but true beauty can only be seen in the frozen sea beneath the glaciers. On the battlefield, that passionate voice was exclaiming about the strength of life and describing his own understanding of glaciers. This long incantation was now reaching its end. Amidst the heavy snow that made it difficult for people to see clearly, that deep male voice was guiding all those who wished to survive. Everyone knew that once this voice ended, everything would come to an end. If they wanted to survive, they would have to stop this voice from continuing. However, their path to survival was blocked by newborn ice element creatures. The endless number of snow monsters, ice demons, and ice element creatures would be endless. In a different location, newborn ice element creatures wouldn't be able to fight against the Chaos Abyss army. But in this special time period, these ice element creatures could use their elemental power to crush these demons who were unable to use their supernatural powers. Even further north in the Northlands, I passed through the eternal sea of ice as the undead. Yet, I still struggled to survive in an extremely cold cave. That fatal northernmost wind could freeze and shatter my soul. Fortunately, I witnessed a beautiful aurora before I was in a daze. On a snow-white plain, the sky opened up a window of color. That was a beautiful scene I'll never be able to imagine. This was all Roland's previous understanding of ice and snow. It was also the original Ice Aeon incantation. But after this, there were some differences. At the end of the void, in the land of reincarnation, ice and snow are the foundation of life. For the undead, every ice crystal is a piece of flesh and blood. A body of flesh and blood is no different from a body of ice and snow. The secrets of life are revealed in ice and snow. The most common magic in the mortal plane was the four elements of water, fire, earth, and wind. These four elements were also the source of all magic. The reason for this was because they were the four elements that made up the world of He. Research that discovered the laws and essence of nature finally developed into natural science and modern civilization. Research that explored the secrets and origins of the world of He also created elemental magic and a brilliant magical civilization. But now, He wasn't the only mortal plane. Death, law, ice, and holy light. Previously, these were all derivative and composite concepts of the four elements. But now, as the four elements of hell, these concepts were basically the cornerstones of elemental magic. They would become more and more common, and this commonality would greatly increase the number of elemental users as well as the elemental magic's effects and abilities. As the users and elemental magic's effects became stronger, the number of derivative concepts would also increase. It would be quite troublesome to explain in theory, but it would be quite simple to put it into practice. The newly born holy light now had the common function of the light of salvation. Law and death were combined together, giving birth to the power of hell's judgment that could directly judge and even kill based on the natural laws of hell. Meanwhile, ice, the power of life that represented the undead in hell, also gained a new concept and effect. Life ice. The Great Snow Mountain magical realm was a newly born ice elemental plane. The frigid moss species here had already begun a complete evolution. Ice magic, which had originally only been derived from water magic, was now becoming more and more independent. Since some major magic spells were capable of drawing upon the power of the ice elemental planes, ice magic and talents would be strengthened once again. The most obvious change was now known to everyone. It's now much easier to summon and create ice element creatures and magical puppets. It's now possible to create pure ice elemental creatures. It's quite easy to make ice and snow form their own will. It's also much easier for undead to evolve after they've been given bodies of ice. This was a rule that mages had recently discovered. However, ice mages weren't mainstream in this world to begin with, so the effects weren't that obvious. The most obvious change was that ice mages could now bring more elemental pets with them as meat shields. More undead mages would learn ice magic as well. But as the most famous undead and ice mages in the world, they now had new understandings of forbidden spells. The Ice Age era is about to begin. That will be a paradise for ice and snow creatures. The revised incantation was an additional incantation. The ice element, which had originally been a byproduct of forbidden spells, was now being developed again. Countless ice elemental creatures walked out from within, and the gathered ice and snow automatically opened up an elemental door. On the other side was the familiar endless snow mountains, the ice elemental plane, the great snow mountain magical realm. This elemental door wasn't a true teleportation portal. However, high-level ice elemental creatures had placed their own life imprints into it, which meant that they had anchored their souls to the ice elemental plane. Even if their physical bodies were destroyed, they would be sent back to the ice elemental plane, just like the fire elemental lords who died in the mortal plane. This elemental door was also helping the ice elemental creatures to evolve and grow. Under the illumination of this elemental door, many ice elemental creatures obtained their own will and even started evolving on their own. Now, an ice elemental lord had appeared. That gigantic ice phoenix with several hundred baby phoenixes had already obtained her true name in the ice elemental plane. She had even transformed into a human form. Her human form of ice was wearing an extravagant crown of ice crystals. Every time she waved her sparkling icicle staff, a rain of icicles would fall from the sky. The ice phoenixes around her were all sealed in ice. Any demon that came into contact with them wouldn't even be able to self-destruct. Ice phoenixes were basically the bane of all Chaos War slaves. The most ridiculous part was that this small area contained an endless amount of ice element. The power of the ice element was comparable to the power of the elemental throne. Ice elemental creatures were rapidly evolving within this area. Even if they were defeated, they would be able to rapidly regenerate by replenishing the ice element. This was an idea that Ice Elemental Lord had come up with after being forced into a corner. A magical pet that was even more skilled in magic than a forbidden spell mage herself had been longing for a new elemental plane with ice elemental lords and ice elemental creatures. This created this miraculous creation. The snow froze the endless number of Chaos War slaves. The Chaos War slaves were unable to use any supernatural abilities against the endless number of ice elemental creatures. However, the ice elemental creatures that could use the power of ice actually had a qualitative advantage over the ice elemental creatures. Finally, ever since the demon wave began, the Chaos faction's endless number of Chaos War slaves were being suppressed. Under Harlow's control, the ice castle from before appeared once again. This ice castle had been repeatedly reinforced and increased in height. This would be fatal for the demons that were stuck in the snow and slid on the ground. The demons' attacks were stopped, and the forbidden spell's incantation was about to end. It seemed that victory was about to arrive. But at this moment, a black beam of light descended. Asterisk boom. Asterisk the newly constructed ice castle wall and the Moonwheel Capital's main gate were simultaneously sliced apart. A black giant approached the city wall, causing the elves in the city to fall into despair and fear. Not only did the black obsidian greatsword slice apart the Moonwheel Capital's final city gate, it also shattered the elves' morale that the Moonwheel Capital's defenders had been lucky. The scene before them even broke their backs. The supreme light of the elves, Donades appeared with two spoils of war at his waist. These were two skulls that were still dripping with divine power. These two skulls belonged to the elven gods, Anslo and Sonia. These two gods' eyes were filled with fear and disbelief. It was as if they couldn't believe that they had already died. But now, even Harlow's, who had gotten her revenge, couldn't smile anymore. That was because the black giant god's next target was the new Borealis, which was not far away in the sky. Chapter 645. Donades had made so many preparations, but when it came time for the final battle, they would have to face each other head-on. The magical snow obscured both sides' vision. The defenders instinctively and passively defended, While they were delighted that the enemy's attacks had weakened, they didn't expect that the god of death had already arrived. Asterisk boom. Asterisk Donades sliced through the city wall with his sword. His next attack swept through all the guards and ballistic cannons on the city wall. Pitch-black shadows covered the giant god's body. His silent eyes were burning like black suns. Behind him, in the icy snow, the headless and dismembered corpses of the gods had already piled up into a small mountain. The Chaos War God had once again proven his power in this battle. In less than an hour, the entire elf god faction that had attempted to stop the demon wave had been destroyed like mantises trying to stop a chariot. Donati's next step will be the floating battleships in the sky. As long as he eliminated the caster of the forbidden spell that was threatening the demon wave, and the snow that was obstructing the Chaos Abyss's army would stop, everything would return to normal. However, what astonished Donates was that after a short period of fear, the mortals didn't despair. Instead, they organized their final defense line. A withered and heavily injured Treant elder charged forward. However, Donates stomped him into smithereens. Meanwhile, his companions transformed into a forest of thorns that became a bloodwood defense line. The elven rangers had long since finished shooting their last arrows. They howled savagely, just like the beastmen that they looked down on in the past. They raised their weapons and charged forward to their deaths, all in order to stall the elf gods for a few more seconds. As the elf gods were all destroyed, the elf gods' elven priests and priestesses either instantly went insane or directly died. The few remaining young priests had tears in their eyes as they held their wooden clubs and fought for their lives. They died the same way as the rangers. What happened to the warriors that always stood at the front? At this time, the elven warrior job classes that were still alive and able to walk no longer deserved to be called warriors. Silver elf nobles? Moon elf royalty? Wild elf bastards? At this moment, there was no difference. Everyone knew that if they didn't risk their lives, they would die. But at least there was a glimmer of hope. In the floating city, there were all the elves, children, and books. They were the hope of the future. The Mist Alliance's reinforcements had already completed their mission. The ordinary warriors had already returned to the floating airships, as ordered. However, Renee still had a complex expression as she watched the elves rush off to their deaths. Even though she didn't have a favorable impression of the elves, she still had a slight favorable impression of the brave warriors who sacrificed themselves to protect the elves. War God Donates himself was actually the one who was moved by this scene the most. He happily welcomed every warrior's challenge on the battlefield. His joy was even greater than when he had fought Anslow to the death. He carefully avoided massacres and directly killed every warrior who challenged him. Every time a warrior's physical body was destroyed, another person would appear in the empty Valkyrie palace. Even in the face of despair, the souls of brave warriors are the foundation of Valkyrie. Aren't we being a little too despicable? No, we only told them information. This is all their choice. Indeed, this sacrifice was valuable. Donates had been addicted to accepting the warriors' challenges and appreciating the warriors' soul light before their deaths. This caused him to slow down in his slaughter. This had already happened once in the Chaos Abyss. Donates admired the weak who dared to challenge him. It was no secret that he would give them more time to use their full potential. However, the fact that he was willing to use this as a method to stall for time showed how cruel and merciless the person who came up with this idea was. It could only be said that Donates had reached the point where he had to find a way out. Rain was still too young. The information she had passed on had caused this scene before her, and the inexplicable sense of guilt made it hard for her to breathe. Is there a difference? Even if we scatter and retreat, Donates will probably kill us even faster if he gets serious about killing us. Harloise was quite open-minded about this. Even so, the elves' sacrifice wouldn't be able to buy much time. Donates would soon realize his mistake. The other obstacle was that the newly born elemental lords wouldn't even be worth mentioning in front of Donates. Donates' pure power would still overwhelm everything. Only the courageous would win. This seemed to have become an ironclad rule on the battlefield. However, very few people noticed that the prerequisite for this rule was that both sides were roughly equal in power. In front of pure brute force, bravery would only be able to stall for time before death. But there was still a second part to the courageous would win. When the courageous meet, the wise win. Since bravery was useless, perhaps the side that planned more beforehand would have an easier time obtaining the final victory. This is the final gamble. Activate the backup plan. 10 minutes ago, a certain decision was made. At this moment, a tremendous explosion came from the source of the demon wave. If anyone could see through the snow in the sky, they would be able to see that snowflakes were also spreading in that direction, but exploding at an even faster speed. Marguerite's copy of the Ice Aeon? Has it already begun? Donati's is undefeatable in the demon wave, but if he's not in the demon wave? From the very start, our faction was missing a bunch of people. Adam, Marguerite, and the others had arrived here on an airship together with us, but they had split up not long ago. Calculating their travel time, they should have arrived here before us, since they had arrived on an assault airship in advance. It was just that their destination was different. Their mission was to attack when necessary, interfere with the Chaos Abyss's dimensional forces, and temporarily cut off the demon wave. This was a backup plan that we had come up with beforehand, as well as a choice that we had no other choice. What would happen if we kept their outstanding combat strength by our side? Ice Aeon's anti-magic domain would cripple Marguerite as she was a mage. Little Red was the reincarnation of a fire element red dragon. She was still a young dragon, so it was likely that she would freeze to death. Eliza was a peak inferno demon, so she would probably be no different from Little Red. Adam should have been in his best condition, but he just so happened to have a phoenix heart at this time, transforming into a dual element of wind and fire. Not only would he be weakened by the ice, his heart would also stop beating. The final result would likely be that the strongest adventuring team in all of Ike would be slapped to death by the strongest Chaos War God in an environment with the weakest elemental stats. In that case, the elven gods had died quite unjustly. Everyone knew that the elves were the most skilled at magic, yet they had to fight against the Chaos War God in this anti-magic domain. This was just like humans giving up their weapons and fighting against chimpanzees barehanded. It would seem that Anslo wasn't as weak as I had originally thought. So I've been a super useless teammate. Cough, of course, trying to cut off the demon wave would also be incredibly dangerous. But I wouldn't send out a signal unless absolutely necessary. I seem to have forgotten something. That's right, Eliza had also come to the mortal plane. She had sent a message to Anslo. Since Anslo was able to return to the mortal plane through the Chaos Abyss dimensional door, there was no reason why Eliza, who was also a Chaos Lord, wouldn't be unable to return as well. Right now, Eliza was probably waiting on the other side of the Chaos Abyss. When Adam and the others attacked the Chaos Abyss dimensional door, Eliza would pincer attack from both sides. It would be impossible to permanently close a dimensional door that had already stabilized. However, it would be quite easy for Marguerite to simultaneously disrupt the dimensional door's connection to both sides and temporarily cut off the connection between the two planes. Judging from the current situation, the Chaos faction hadn't sent out any powerful Chaos Lords to guard the dimensional door. There had actually been one, but Anslo had conveniently killed one of them. Marguerite's plan was quite successful. At that moment, the demon wave was truly cut off. How long could the demon wave be cut off for? 3 minutes? 1 minute? Half a minute? Nobody could guarantee anything. However, it would still be possible to buy several dozen seconds before the will of the Chaos Abyss became furious. Still, we could sense that Donati's had obviously been weakened from this moment onward. However, the situation hasn't changed yet. Even if an elephant loses half its weight in one night, it can still easily stomp a mouse to death. The Chaos War God's expression didn't change at all. However, the sudden change in the situation caused him to come to a realization. He stopped admiring the heroic soul's performance and directly charged towards the floating battleships, starting a massacre along the way. No, the situation has changed. Venerated Order main gods, your mortal enemy, Donati's, has been isolated from the demon wave. He's alone now, Are you going to miss such an excellent opportunity? I didn't need to do anything. Countless pairs of eyes had been staring at this place ever since the demon wave first appeared. If the Order main gods really wanted to do something, they wouldn't miss this opportunity. Well done, young man. A white-bearded old man suddenly appeared in the sky together with this praise. The white-bearded old man raised his staff and pointed it at Donati's. An arcane cage then descended and tightly locked Donati's within. This white-bearded old man was the wisdom god Calamandas, who had long since been in cahoots with the Hades. Of course, Calamandas would be no match for Donati's, nor would he risk his life for us. However, according to our previous secret agreement, Calamandas would only act when we needed him the most and slightly obstruct us. However, there was a saying called beating a drowning dog. There was also a certain type of behavior called supporting. Calamanda's incarnation vanished without a trace right after it appeared. The next instant, a chain of lightning suddenly appeared out of nowhere and struck Donati's body. A gigantic war hammer descended from the sky and smashed into his head. A small tree sapling suddenly wrapped itself around his feet. Donati's was still dizzy and disoriented. The reinforcements that I had been waiting for the most had finally arrived. Just like last time, a golden holy light incarnation appeared. This incarnation was so bright that no one could see it clearly. However, this incarnation was far more powerful than it had been in the past. The god of holy light had arrived. The god of holy light was the strongest Order main god in the mortal plane. Now that there was an opportunity to kill off a powerful chaos main god who wasn't on his home turf, how could the god of holy light possibly miss out on this opportunity to kill off the vanguard of the chaos main god and spread his faith and divine might? Perhaps this was a trap filled with evil intentions. However, this trap's target wasn't just the elven gods. The end of the cycle of reincarnation has arrived. Ice Aeon shall become eternal. At this moment, I was about to finish my forbidden spell. The moment that I finished my incantation, the forbidden spell Ice Aeon activated. Chapter 646. If the creator of all of Ike was an artist, she would have probably given different colors to all the dimensions and regions. Most of the dimensions would be a mixture of many colors. That would be the result of natural selection. However, there were extremely few extreme dimensions that would always be monochromatic due to the existence of overly strong dimensional and dimensional laws. For example, the deepest part of the ocean was blue. Only aquatic species would know the color underwater. The chaos abyss was blood red. The demons of chaos used their own blood, as well as the flesh and blood of others, to irrigate this land. Mountain paradise was golden. That was the overly powerful light of order. In the past, it would have been difficult for ordinary people to survive in these regions due to the intense colors. However, the current Moonwheel capital was monochromatic. Here, there was only white. Ice Aeon shall be eternal. The moment that the golden god of holy light appeared, the seemingly endless incantation came to an end. As the final incantation ended, the Ice Age descended upon the world. With me as the core, the entire world began to change colors. All colors were wiped out. In the end, the only thing left in this world was an endless expanse of white. The countless demons in the demon wave finally stopped moving. The inferno dragons in the sky transformed into ice sculptures that shattered into pieces. The demon army that had been so noisy just a moment ago transformed into countless lifelike ice sculptures in the next instant. These ice sculptures were so translucent that even the naked eye could see their hearts and soul fire rapidly extinguishing. The glaciers continued spreading. The snow devoured everything. The trees, mountains, and rivers became white. There was no forgiveness, no exceptions. Only those within the range of the forbidden spell would be frozen. Even the clouds would be frozen. Even the sunlight would be frozen. Even the magma deep underground would be frozen. The glaciers continued spreading. The plains became snowy plains. The rivers became icy lakes. The forests became snowy forests. And the mountains became glaciers. The demon army that was several dozen kilometers, or even several hundred kilometers away, transformed into exquisite art pieces the moment they encountered the glaciers. They entered eternity together with the demon army. The Moonwheel capital was finished. The ruined city walls, palaces, and demons all transformed into ice sculptures. Although the Moonwheel capital wasn't frozen because it was the center, the extreme coldness in the surroundings was gradually eroding this only paradise. In the end, everything would be reduced to ice and snow. Even several hundred kilometers away, the Chaos Abyss dimensional door was frozen by the forbidden spell. The unlucky ones that didn't have the time to teleport were directly sealed in ice. Only the strongest demon lords were still fighting against the ice that covered their skin. A moment ago, the battlefield was still noisy, but in the next moment, it was so quiet that it was terrifying. Due to many factors, this ice aeon once again set a new record in history. The entire Elven Empire was frozen, and everything was forcefully dyed white. The number of casualties was incalculable. The massive river of ice even flowed backwards into the gate of the abyss, freezing that layer of the abyss into a river of ice. Countless demon reserve troops were completely annihilated in their sleep. Perhaps the furious will of the Chaos Abyss would soon notice this place, and a new demon wave would be driven into the mortal plane. However, at this moment, the demon wave and demon lords that invaded the mortal plane had indeed been completely destroyed. The demon wave had stopped. If one could look down from outer space, one would probably see that the entire continental plate had been forcefully dyed white. It wasn't that nobody had ever thought of using forbidden spells against the demon wave before. However, I was the only one who had truly succeeded. After all, although forbidden spells were rare, they weren't extinct. However, in front of an endless demon wave, forbidden spells had a casting limit that was more than enough to kill the caster over 100 times. Not everyone had a main god-level powerful individual sacrificing themselves to act as a meat shield. But now, I was unable to feel happy. I'm going to die. I'm going to die. I'm going to die. Not only did I use up all of my mana, I felt like I had used up all of my mental energy and mana in my next life. My entire body hurt, and I couldn't even move a single finger. My head felt like it was about to split open. It was as if 500 ducks were having a meeting inside my head, and they were all speaking in different dialects. The fact that you're still able to say such a thing means that you're still far from death. While my head was still spinning, Harloise was still laughing at my misfortune. However, she examined me for me and heaved an obvious sigh of relief. How inconceivable. There aren't any permanent after effects even after all this. Do you really want me to split my luggage that badly? Are you the second senior brother that the monkeys sent? As I spoke nonsense, I struggled to climb back up to my feet. I discovered that my body had only been overdrawn. Not only did Harloise feel relieved, even I myself heaved a sigh of relief. There was a price to pay for using forbidden spells. Even the tiniest bit of magical backlash from a powerful forbidden spell would destroy the soul of the person who came into contact with it. The price to pay for a forbidden spell would most likely be the caster's life and soul. At the very least, it would be the caster's lifespan and health. No matter if the spell was successfully cast or not, a forbidden spell mage would typically die very quickly. This was also why only a few special existences like Yongya were able to cast forbidden spells multiple times. Back in the day, Yongya was a great lich with a silver bloodline. He relied on his system's assistance to forcefully repair his damaged soul with fate points, which was why he was able to do so much. This time, there were no lasting after effects. It was probably because this body's bloodline was strong enough to withstand the backlash from the forbidden spell. Right, there should be a reward for killing so many of them, right? Yes, I'm still calculating. However, you should be able to obtain your myth-ranked weapon. This was an unexpected surprise, but I didn't have the time to be happy right now. Notify the entire fleet to begin a large-scale retreat. We're already running. You don't need to tell us. The fleet had indeed begun moving. The moment that the forbidden spell activated, Yongya had already hidden himself in the land of Hades. The moment that the forbidden spell activated, our fleet began fleeing for their lives. Behind us were two gigantic snow elephants. One of them had twisted wings of light on its back, while the other was a gigantic giant. Even a main god would be instantly frozen if they were hit by a forbidden spell at such a close distance. Soon, our sensors sent us the latest image. The statue of light directly shattered into pieces. It was obvious that it was only a clone. However, I was rather delighted. After all, being able to kill off one of the God of Holy Light's clones to vent my anger was already the best result in my calculations. If the God of Holy Light's true body had come, we wouldn't have been able to take it. As for its opponent, the black giant, it immediately thawed out in an instant. The gigantic black war god looked towards us, seemingly intending to chase after us. However, he then furrowed his eyebrows and seemed to be hesitating. Seeing this scene, I knew that my plan had succeeded. Luring a main god to attack Donati's wasn't really for the sake of killing him. After all, when considering how powerful the Chaos War God was and how much time the demon wave had left, the success rate would be rather low. The scene just now also served as a warning to Donati's and the Order main gods that if we left the battlefield in the Chaos Abyss now that the demon wave had been cut off, it was highly likely that we would be surrounded and attacked by the Order main gods. That would be quite a joke. Of course, just because Donati's wasn't chasing after us now didn't mean that we were safe. Even if the demon wave had been sealed in ice for tens of thousands of kilometers, the demon wave would soon return. If Donati's didn't regain some of his dignity from us, he wouldn't be able to continue living in the Chaos Abyss anymore. However, for the situation to develop to this point, it was already the best outcome that everyone could accept. The demon wave had arrived. Although it had been temporarily defeated, the Order faction had also experienced the threat of the demon wave. It was likely that they could now focus on preparing for battle. Even if I hadn't recorded the battle, the fairies would have taught the human kingdoms and emperors just how terrifying the demon wave was. On the other hand, although a portion of the elves had managed to escape, they had indeed greatly weakened the demon wave. The other human kingdoms would be able to accept this result and the elves' military accomplishments. At the very least, they would acknowledge the Northland's elves' rise and their status as part of the Order faction. Of course, the most important reason was that Anslo and the elven gods had perished. At the very least, the elves would no longer be a threat to the human kingdoms in this holy war. With the Mist Alliance's guarantee, it would be possible to let them go. As for the elves, although they had lost the elven gods, they now had the possibility of being accepted by the Mortal Plains factions. They also had the chance to recover and rise again. As long as their inheritance and history still existed, along with the countless Valkyrie children still growing up, the elves' future would be even brighter than when the elven gods were still alive. Something worth mentioning was that the Elven Empire, Elven Empress Aphina I, and the 4 superior elf leaders had all died for their country. They had all refused to take the path of survival. In the end, she's still like an empress by now. Everyone knew that the future of the elves would belong to the Northland's Elven Empire. And as long as Aphina was still alive, there would be moon elves who would reminisce about their former home country and the times when their species was high above everyone else. The other Northland's elves would definitely be on guard against them. In that case, the invisible chasm and schemes would gradually split the elves apart. Even Harloise would find it difficult to deal with this. In the end, the best result would probably be to marginalize the moon elves from their former home country. As long as Aphina and the other superior elf leaders all died in battle, the ordinary moon elves and minor nobles would accept reality. As long as Harloise and the other superior elf leaders didn't reform the old system and treat the moon elves differently, the moon elves would receive the same treatment as the 4 superior elf leaders. Everyone could see and understand these schemes, but nobody said anything about it. Meanwhile, Aphina's final decision might not be a good choice for an elven empress, but she would at least be a good choice for a moon elf leader. The sky is so blue. I looked out the window. The snow was gone, and the sky was clear. There wasn't even a single cloud to be seen. all the clouds had been struck down by a forbidden spell. This type of weather was indeed perfect for escaping, traveling. In just a short 10 minutes, Adam and the others had already given the signal for the demon wave to begin again. This time, the demons that jumped out were all high-level demons. At the very least, the Inferno demon dragon army that just rushed out of the Chaos Abyss were quite frightening. Several supreme, immemorial demon dragons from the depths of the Chaos Abyss had even come out. Our next stop was to hurry northward and break through the Hurrit Mountains according to the plan. We would then pass through that incredibly difficult snowy mountain. At the very least, the Chaos Abyss's ground troops wouldn't be able to catch up to us. Why didn't we go through the human kingdoms? Considering how many demons were chasing after us, I felt that any demon lord with a normal IQ would definitely forbid us from entering. This path is truly rather difficult. Chapter 6:47. Even though the airships had been retreating for more than 5 hours, and I had already fallen asleep, I could still see the endless white, snowy plains outside my window. The sunny sky and the thick layer of snow didn't seem like a good match at all. The forbidden spell had changed the terrain of the continent, and as for me, that's right. In such ridiculous weather, I want to lie in my warm blankets and enjoy the snowy scenery while enjoying the fragrance of hot cocoa. And while I'm at it, I also want to watch others fight to the death. If there's a limit to making people angry and mocking you, you're definitely a main god. The battle hadn't ended yet. The first wave of demon dragons had been defeated just 10 minutes ago, and they were still following us from far away. The first wave only had 3 Inferno demon dragons. However, 2 of them were immemorial, and 1 was supreme immemorial. The supreme immemorial dragon was likely far stronger than Little Red had been before she had transformed. Our mercenaries were useful, but the dozen or so black and red dragons were quite difficult to deal with. We had to rely on the airship's cannons to force them to retreat. At the most dangerous moment, even Renee, the blue dragon concubine, had to personally join the battle. Furthermore, we were still in the ice plains, and mana was low. Inferno demon dragons were of the fire element, so it would indeed be quite difficult for them to survive in such an environment. Plus, it would take far too long to travel from the Chaos Abyss to the mortal plane, so they probably wouldn't even be able to use half of their full power. The Chaos Abyss demon dragons were probably the first to catch up to them. After they sent out a signal, the other demon dragons would probably arrive soon. But considering how chaotic and selfish the Chaos faction was, it was quite likely that they would eat themselves to death. Compared to the truly troublesome Donati's, this really isn't much. Donati's hadn't personally pursued the demon dragons, which was the only good news. But, as the commander of the demon wave, it was to be expected that he would be unable to leave the demon wave. Still, he definitely wouldn't take this lying down. It was also expected that he would take revenge. Both the Order faction and Chaos faction could reluctantly accept such an ending on the battlefield. It would be difficult to say who was the victor in this battle. Judging from the battle results, we had killed off a tremendous number of Chaos Abyss war slaves, as well as saved the elves' future and inheritance. The Northland's Elven Empire joining the Mist Alliance would greatly increase the Mist Alliance's power level and foundational resources. Large numbers of elven smiths, mages, and drool would be incalculable wealth. In that case, we should count as the victors and beneficiaries of this battle. But from the perspective of the Chaos Abyss, the demon wave had successfully descended, and the Elven Empire that had been in their way had been completely destroyed. The elven gods had been completely destroyed, and even a main god had been killed. This was the greatest victory of any holy war in the history of the Chaos faction. Judging from the difference in power between the Chaos faction and the Chaos faction was the true victor. It seemed that only the elves were the losers, but from a certain standpoint, this was the brightest and most promising future for the elves. It was a kind of happiness for a rich and powerful family to have a lot of wealth, but a poor family who guarded a priceless family heirloom was inviting trouble for themselves. And if the rich ancestor of the poor family caused a lot of hatred, as a rich heir who was always on tenterhooks, he couldn't just throw away the burden and start all over again. At the very least, we'll be able to get rid of the elven gods that make us feel helpless. Perhaps we'll have a better life. As for the elven god's death, it could be said that it was inevitable. The elves have been so famous and powerful before, but now they had lost so little. Yet, the elves had always been ambitious enough to want to revive and rebel. The end result was that the Order gods wanted them dead, and the Chaos evil gods wanted them dead as well. And so, the elves truly died. The elves wanted to be a third party, but they weren't a third party that was independent and absolutely neutral. Instead, they wanted to play around with power and tricks. They wanted to be a third party that was on the fence, trying to curry favor with both sides. This third party would be the third party that would be the one to reap the benefits. Yet, this third party didn't have enough power or intelligence. Since neither side in this battle was an idiot, it was only natural that this third party would be more dead than dead. Even if the Chaos faction hadn't entered the Moon Wheel capital this time, it was highly likely that the elves would still be in trouble. No matter which side attacked the elves, the other side would only happily watch as the elves died. Did the elves really think that the elves would be fooled by their internal strife? As long as the elven gods didn't perish, both sides would forever view the elves as enemies. At the very least, they wouldn't treat the elves as allies. And since the elves didn't have enough power to protect themselves and still tried to remain neutral, it would only be a matter of time before the elves died. This was the general trend. An individual's power would indeed be quite powerless in front of so many factors that would affect the direction of history. Perhaps it was precisely because the elven gods saw through all of this that they were willing to die so easily. At the very least, they died quite valiantly. No, they were just tricked by you. Don't try to flatter them, and don't try to clear your own name. Harlowe seemed quite carefree. She peeled an apple for me while secretly eating it. She was even humming a little tune while crossing her legs. Right now, Harlowe's true body was sitting next to my bed. That was because I could only lie down in my current condition. Any random thief would be able to kill me, so I still needed some combat strength to protect me. Right now, the most reliable combat strength on the airship was Harlowe's. But what was the meaning of wearing a dress with a slit in the middle of a snowy day? And you were even crossing your legs. Cough, cough. I couldn't help but retract my gaze. White thighs, large breasts, and so on are all useless. They were nothing more than slime figurines. So what was there to look at? Put down that fruit knife and stop waving it in front of my nose. We could still be friends. Cough, cough. Getting back to the main topic, we hadn't actually done much over the past few days. All we had done was rush up to the demon wave, toss a forbidden spell, and then run away. This was the legendary running away after acting cool, just for the thrill. No, you did quite a bit this time. I received some new news while you were sleeping. You're now number 7 on the Calamity rankings. Should I congratulate you? Damn, why am I on the Calamity rankings again? Didn't you say that I was safe? Safe? You can toss a forbidden spell, yet you're still alive and kicking, and you're still talking about being safe? If you don't count as a humanoid calamity, who does? In 2 days, all the major countries will probably blacklist you and be on guard against you. You also need to be careful of assassins, even in human countries. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry as I nodded. Even if Harlowe didn't remind me, I knew what to do. It was common for allies who seemed to be blood-related to each other to steal strategic weapons and technology. Right, what I wanted you to do, it's done. I've already collected everything in Yonya City. However, it's too sensitive right now, so it's best not to touch it. But I think that no matter what you want to do, it should be enough. I nodded in satisfaction. This time I was so happy that I actually laughed out loud. Of my 4 paths, death was the bloodiest and cruelest. No matter what reason we had for walking down this path, if we wanted to walk down this path of death, we would need a sufficient amount of souls and corpses. As I mentioned before, corpses were no longer necessary at my level. However, if I wanted to create my own myth-ranked weapon, I would need a tremendous amount of undead and souls. The strongest of my 4 magic swords would require a tremendous amount of souls. The more despairing and negative the soul, the better it would be. Back in the Chaos Abyss, in order to obtain souls, we even had the idea of searching for the creator of undead magic, the most ancient demon of all. However, we were forced into a corner. In order to collect a sufficient amount of souls, there would be a better place than on the battlefield. The stronger the power, the more excited the emotions, and the more despairing the negative emotions, the better the undead would be. On the battlefield, the souls of countless brave warriors would burn themselves to the limit, which would easily give birth to powerful undead creatures. Many ancient battlefields were places of eternal death. When I cast my forbidden spell, an uncountable number of Chaos War slaves died. Rather than returning their souls to the river Styx and transforming them into demons again, it would be better for me to use their souls as ingredients. Since I had cast my forbidden spell, I didn't have the time to do anything else. That was why I asked Harloise to help me collect undead souls before the battle began. Only Harloise would be capable of such a shady task. Judging from Harloise's proud expression, she must have collected quite a few undead souls. Do you know that your current actions have completely enraged someone? A third person suddenly appeared, which surprised us. At the same time, Harloise blocked my path. I could sense that an astonishing amount of magic power was gathering in Harloise's hand. If anyone dared to take one more step forward, they would be torn apart by her explosive magic, even if, in a way, this person was Harloise's only relative. Didina, you've truly surprised me. It would seem that you're still hiding many things. Didina smiled as well. However, her smile contained a hint of bitterness. Then, let me start from the very beginning. I'll start from my lover, Cavendish Miss Noble Goal. Chapter 648. In that case, let me start from the very beginning. I'll start with my lover, Cavendish Miss Noble Goal. When Didina said such a thing, my first reaction wasn't the delight of discovering some secret. Instead, this circle is indescribably chaotic. If that's the case, if Didina is my sister-in-law, then doesn't that make Harloise my niece? Could it be that all my luck with women had been sucked away by that bastard? It would seem that he had an older sister fetish. Forget about the devil lord from before. He didn't even spare a 10,000-year-old succubus? How enviable. This was insane and outrageous. Yep, I had to condemn such a greedy and wasteful behavior. Asterisk whoosh. Asterisk the sound of a flying fruit knife whizzing past my ears suppressed all of my dirty thoughts. Through our soul connection, I learned that Harloise, who seemed to be smiling happily, was actually on the verge of going berserk. Sister-in-law. Didina, do you have any information about Cavendish? Loud explosions could be heard outside the window. I glanced outside, and it seemed that another battle had begun. I couldn't even get out of bed right now, so I could only listen to Didina's story. Meanwhile, Didina shook her head as she worriedly began her sensational story. Cavendish is searching for the abyss of chaos. That's far too dangerous, the abyss of chaos. Wasn't the entire chaos abyss the abyss of chaos? We paused in surprise for a moment, but then came to a realization as Didina pointed downwards. The end of the cycle of reincarnation, the true bottom of the chaos abyss. If it was anyone else, they probably wouldn't even know what the deepest part of the chaos abyss was. However, I just happened to know, and I placed great importance on it. After all, that was the place where Cynthia's physical body is sleeping. This time, it was Didina's turn to be astonished. She was unable to imagine how a young man, who is only slightly more than 300 years old like me, would know such an ancient secret. TSK. Perhaps it won't be a secret anymore in a few centuries. The holy war between order and chaos was also a harvest of lives and souls by the two creator gods. A tremendous amount of nourishment was injected into the slumbering creator goddess of chaos physical body. Once she woke up, it would be the end of the world. Logically speaking, we created the Hades and cut off a part of the cycle of reincarnation. The people of order who worshipped the gods of the Hades would no longer belong to the pillar of order. A part of the river Styx also entered the Hades. The nutrients in the cycle of reincarnation would no longer be enough. The awakening of the two goddesses should be a long time coming. On the other hand, the goddess of order's soul fragment was with me, and during the battle of the Hades, Cynthia's soul fragment was taken away by Cavendish. Damn, So that was the problem. What is he going to do in the depths of the abyss? To wake Cynthia? Or should he destroy her body? Or I could use my demon's innate ability to devour the mother goddess body and soul. There were too many possibilities, and it was hard to make a decision. But no matter how he thought about it, it was definitely not a good thing. All right then, since I didn't know, I might as well directly ask. It would seem that Roland was also here to give me information. I don't know. He's never told me before. It's just that he's been searching for more than 200 years, and recently, he seems to have found some clues. Then, you previously said that we'll offend someone by collecting souls? Yes. Several years ago, Cavendish told me that this holy war was incredibly important, and that it would be best if the river Styx was filled with souls. I nodded. In that case, it made sense that Roland had been causing trouble everywhere since the start of the holy war. Since he needed to speed up the cycle of reincarnation in order to provide the goddess of order's physical body with sufficient nutrients, it would seem that he was indeed interested in Cynthia's physical body. Perhaps obtaining Cynthia's soul fragment in the Hades would be the equivalent of obtaining the key to the deepest depths of the Chaos Abyss. But what exactly did he want? He was already a Chaos main god. What else did he need? An eternal holy war between order and chaos? Cavendish didn't care about boring things like honor. Something must have piqued his interest for him to be so proactive. Is this also the reason why you betrayed him? We've always had a purely physical relationship based on personal benefits. It's not really a betrayal. He needs my knowledge and memories to help him investigate the path to the Chaos Abyss. I need his power to secretly support me. Dedina paused for a moment as a mysterious red blush appeared on her face. In many ways, he was indeed a good lover. We had a great time together. However, what he wants to find is far too dangerous. Once the will of the Chaos Abyss and her physical body completely awakens, everything will go out of control. Perhaps the entire world will be destroyed. No matter what he thinks, I haven't lived long enough. And judging from the current situation, only you can stop him. If such a situation really occurred, it wouldn't be that the world might be destroyed. The world would definitely be destroyed. I fell silent. To be honest, I really didn't want to care about Cavendish at all. In my mind, if he was serious, he would probably be an even more difficult enemy to deal with than Donati's. However, some things couldn't be ignored just because you wanted to. Convince him? Tell him that this might lead to the end of the world? He wouldn't be Cavendish if he listened to my advice. Even if the end of the world was right in front of him, he would care more about how much fun he could obtain from the end of the world. This bastard who thought with animal instincts was completely illogical and impossible to communicate with. I felt even more of a headache now. If Carwin's messed things up and Cynthia jumped out, it would be impossible for mortals to deal with her. Would I really have to go and release Astria? Wouldn't that just mean that everything I worked so hard for will be back to square one? I felt that Cavendish had spent so much effort to break free from Cynthia's restraints. He definitely wouldn't want to find another mother for himself. But no matter how I thought about it, this wouldn't be a good result for the residents of the mortal plane. Meanwhile, Dedina unhesitatingly got up and left after saying such a shocking statement. She said that she was leaving, but she wasn't just leaving this room. She was saying goodbye to us. She said that it seemed that it was rare for her to be able to travel around the mortal plane and that she had her own things to do. We didn't stop her. We simply agreed on a few contact points and contact methods before allowing her to leave. Meanwhile, both Harlois and I heaved sighs of relief as we watched Dedina leave. After Dedina left, we exchanged glances with each other, not knowing what to say. Let's gather information first. At the very least, we need to know what he wants. Astria, what you know is what I know. Dedina was as useless as ever. It would seem that I could only rely on myself. I could only helplessly shake my head. No matter what, it was likely that this trip to the Chaos Abyss was far from over. No matter what Cavendish wants, since he needs blood to flow like rivers and souls to fill the river Styx, we need to prevent such a possibility from happening. Considering how a certain someone just cast a forbidden spell and completed one of the largest massacres in all of history, this isn't convincing at all. I was actually starting to regret my decision. our Yongya city would only be able to collect a limited number of undead, and the forbidden spell would have such a large area of effect. There would definitely be a tremendous number of souls entering the river Styx. I could only shake my head helplessly. I didn't have any other choice. Even if I knew about all this beforehand, I would still have likely been forced to cast a forbidden spell. There was no meaning in regretting. I didn't intend to make this information public either. After all, I still had to consider the enemy's life or death on the battlefield. I couldn't kill too many. Was I supposed to just let the enemy cut off my head? Considering all this would be the equivalent of carrying an unnecessary burden on my shoulders. It would be no different from suicide. Chapter 649. The seven Order main God-level God Kings were the peak existences of the Order main gods. They were undeniably the gods among the gods. The 14 Chaos main gods each occupied one or more dimensions and ruled over a region. They had always been viewed as the peak existences of the entire world. They were living history, and mortals even viewed them as eternal existences like the rising and setting of the sun. But in the recent 10 years, these peak existences finally changed, proving that there was no such thing as eternal in this world. This directly shook the comparison between the Order and Order main gods. During the Battle of the Hades, the Chaos faction had lost a Chaos main god, the Lord of Putrefaction. However, his death was just like the Battle of the Hades itself. It wasn't announced to the world. Only those who were related to the Chaos faction and the Chaos faction learned of the fact that even main gods could die. In the past, Anslow's betrayal had greatly shocked the powerful individuals of the mortal world. News of Anslow's death instantly spread to all the human kingdoms, causing people to sigh at the cruelty of the Holy War, as well as allowing mortals to understand the truth. So it turns out that even a Lord God can fall. Yi Futian sighed. In the current world of He, the Order faction only had 5 main god-level existences, while the Chaos faction still had 13 main gods. Although this still seemed quite unbalanced, mortals weren't worried about this. That was because the Chaos main gods hadn't all participated in the previous Holy War. Not only that, there are also differences between main gods. The publicly acknowledged strongest main god was still the god of holy light, who had always been worshipped by the world of He. However, very few people knew that this time, the Chaos faction didn't have any restrictions at all. As long as the Chaos main gods desired the flesh and souls of the mortal plane, they could voluntarily participate in the battle. It could be said that this holy war was destined to be the most difficult ever. The death of the Elven Empire and the Elven gods was perhaps the most eye-catching opening act of the Holy War. However, on the second day, another piece of news shocked the entire world. Finbert, the capital of the Mist Mountains and the capital of the AMU Mountains in San Antonio, now had an even more famous name, the Chaos Abyss Fortress Finbert. 8 years ago, the great demons, who were originally part of the Chaos race, walked out of the forest and sacrificed the residents of this land to the Chaos faction in exchange for a large number of demon reinforcements. However, before they could walk out of the mountains, they were met with a head-on attack. At San Antonio's invitation, the Holy Church brought an angel army to the AMU Mountains defense line. Both sides fought on the front lines of the eternal holy war here. Due to the dimensional laws of the mortal plane, both sides tacitly agreed to maintain the number of high-level combatants. This low-intensity battle continued for 8 years. But when the eternal holy war truly began, the so-called tacit understanding between the Holy Church and the Holy Church naturally disappeared without a trace. A tremendous number of demons and Chaos War slaves instantly swarmed onto the battlefield. The low-level angel squadrons suffered heavy losses, and the Holy Church's defensive line only lasted for 16 hours before being completely flattened. The Holy Light warriors that the Holy Church had specially raised also suffered heavy losses. Afterwards, some people said that the Chaos faction had been sly enough to open up 2 demon wave entrances at the same time. However, after investigation, The Holy Church's intelligence personnel confirmed that the explosive increase in reinforcements was only because Finbert's great demons had sacrificed themselves over many years. They had slowly accumulated a tremendous amount of troops. Finally, they had also used the elemental tide brought about by the Holy War to summon 2 demon lords to lead the troops. The demon lords suddenly obtained cannon fodder and high-level combatants, making preparations for the final battle. However, the demon lords still thought that this was a friendly match. Naturally, they lost both quickly and miserably. But the most troublesome matter had only just begun. Since the demon lords obtained victory on this battlefield and obtained a tremendous amount of flesh, blood, and souls as spoils of war, the demon lords performed the highest level of sacrifice and directly opened up a semi-permanent chaos abyss portal. And now, the demon wave truly arrived. This was how the Chaos faction would attack during the Holy War. They would harvest souls and flesh through slaughter and war, and then use the spoils of war to summon even more troops for even more slaughter and sacrifices. This snowball effect would be similar to how undead calamities increased in power. If it wasn't for the fact that the demons who came to the mortal plane would have to pay a price just for existing, it would be impossible for them to stay here for long. They would usually kill and rob before returning to the Chaos Abyss like bandits. However, during the Holy War, the demon army would be dimensional invaders that would steal everything. The danger level of the 2 sides would be incomparable. The end result was that even though the Moonwheel capital was facing the demon wave, the AMU Mountains defense line had completely collapsed. The collapse of the AMU Mountains defense line had not only dealt a major blow to the Holy Church, but also threatened the entire continent of San Antonio. It was likely that this mega-empire would be the most idle among all the mega-empires during the preparation period for the Holy War. Unlike the brainless demon war slaves of the demon wave, the demon armies currently residing in the Chaos Abyss Fortress Finbert were demon armies led by demon lords. These demon armies were intelligent, strategic, and powerful war machines. The Chaos Abyss portal in the Moonwheel capital was still in the demon wave period. Any low-level or mid-level demons that entered the mortal plane through that Chaos Abyss portal would have to pay the price of their rationality. This Chaos Abyss portal, which didn't require any additional price, was quite eye-catching. It was likely that countless demon lords who wanted to invade the mortal plane would take action and bring their own armies to the mortal plane in order to seize the initiative in the eternal Holy War. It's still acceptable. At the very least, San Antonio has plenty of resources. It should be enough to deal with. While this information was acceptable, the next piece of information was rather confusing and nerve-wracking. There are signs of activity in the Demon Abyss in the Lava Cave region of the former Mist Kingdom. Eyewitnesses have discovered signs of dark cultists and high-level demons. I was familiar with the location mentioned in this report. Back in the day, this was where Cavendish had been stationed. Later on, Cavendish had opened up a Chaos Abyss portal and summoned demons to massacre the 7 kingdoms. Demons had previously entered the mortal plane in places where the dimensional laws of order were weak. Not only would invading the mortal plane save on sacrificing resources, it would also be safe and reliable. Judging from the information I received, it was quite likely that a demon army would appear there. However, ever since the Mist Kingdom had been destroyed, the Demon Abyss had fallen silent. There were probably no more demons stationed there. Although Renee didn't say anything after hearing this information, it was quite obvious how worried she was. It was likely that she was burning with impatience and wanted nothing more than to return to the Northlands in a single night. However, not only was it impossible for us to travel at high speed, it was likely that we would have to slow down in just a few hours. Our airship fleet was slowly passing through the snowy mountains. Once we passed through the Hurrit Snow Mountains, which were rarely visited by humans, we would have to let the elves out and have them leave on their own. At that time, unless we didn't care about the elven residents who were migrating, the airship fleet speed would be reduced to walking. However, this wasn't all bad news. At the very least, as the airship fleet's altitude increased, the fire element inferno dragons seemed to be unable to withstand the cold, and were finally giving up. As long as we passed through the Hurrit snow mountains, we would be able to enter the human kingdom's territory and wouldn't have to worry too much about being chased. Meanwhile, we also had some uninvited guests accompanying us. Chapter 650. Before the Holy War, semi-gods are the most powerful existences in the world. Semi-gods meant that they were existences that surpassed mortals, but weren't gods. Ordinary powerful individuals would often believe that semi-gods were inferior to gods, but there was actually no foundational difference between the two. From a certain standpoint, gods were nothing more than semi-gods with their own duties. Divine concepts would give them tremendous benefits, but they would also be restricted in various aspects. It could be said that there was no limit to the semi-god rank. Even main god-level demon princes, demon lords, and undead emperors could be called semi-gods as long as they didn't have divine concepts or divine concepts. In the past, the mortal planes leveling system would give the mortals a rough hint in order to indicate the different levels of cultivation. That was, we need several experts at XX level or higher to deal with an opponent of this level. But now, that was no longer enough. In the past, the semi-god ranks of iron, bronze, silver, and so on were quite useful. That was because most magical beasts and powerful individuals in the mortal plane could be divided into lower and middle ranks. Although there was a huge difference between semi-gods, there weren't that many semi-gods. If a massive mortal plane only had several hundred semi-gods, and every single semi-god was a national treasure of a major country, there would be no need to rank them. The system existed for the sake of reality. Most warriors would spend their entire lives at the silver or gold rank, which made the system pay special attention to the lower and middle ranks. And as the demon wave and holy war descended, it became much easier to advance in power levels. So-called legends, gold, and false saints appeared in large numbers. The most obvious difference was that in the past, gold-ranked individuals would be called masters. They were existences that surpassed the limits of mortals. They would receive great respect and treatment no matter where they went. But during the Holy War, reaching gold rank was just like reaching silver rank in the past. As long as one had willpower and excellent training techniques, it was 100% possible to reach gold rank. In fact, even false legends could be viewed as the limits of mortals. In that case, it would be far too much to call gold rank masters. Besides, in front of a powerful demon army, the difference between gold and silver wasn't that obvious. Cannon fodder that would die in 3 seconds and cannon fodder that would die in 10 seconds wouldn't need to be ranked at all. It was foreseeable that in less than 10 years, pseudo-semi-gods would appear in large numbers as well. However, the difference in combat strength among them would be even more ridiculous than it was now. No matter if it was low or high level, if the evaluation system was still the same as it had been for the past 1,000 years, then it would be impossible to evaluate existences that surpass semi-god. The ranking system itself would become meaningless. That was why when the demon wave officially arrived, the mage country, adventure guilds, and fairies used the previous holy wars as reference and created a new ranking system. The core of this system was to blur out the differences between low-level job classes and carefully differentiate between myth and semi-god top-level individuals. This will allow the ranking system to be useful in actual combat. Such a thing would probably happen once in every holy war. However, this time, due to the holy war's sudden eruption, it came a little too early. The new first rank included the previous iron, bronze, silver, and gold ranks. It could be said that this was a huge step up from the previous iron, bronze, silver, and gold ranks. Since these ranks were still quite low, there wasn't even a proper name for each rank. At this rank, mortals were still trying to discover their own physical body's potential. Warrior job classes didn't even have any supernatural abilities. If a name had to be given, it would probably be something like peak mortal or artisan. The second rank was the unmistakable master rank. The general range included legend and saint ranks. Actually, there wasn't much of a difference between these two ranks in actual combat. At this rank, powerful individuals would begin searching for their own personal paths. Mages would begin learning how to use powerful natural elemental magic. Soul worlds and soul imprints would all be the embodiment of one's self at this rank. The third rank was the legend rank. Past myth and new semi-god were all included in this rank. The powerful individuals at this rank would sublimate their own personal paths into unique combat styles and philosophies. They would fuse everything from their past into their legendary weapons, myth-ranked weapons of the past. Due to the existence of the previous 3 myth rank levels, this rank would be incredibly difficult to pass. But once one passed this rank, it would be a completely different level. The 4th rank was the level surpassers of the original semi-god rank. The powerful individuals at this rank were all unique existences. Their talent and hard work had reached the pinnacle. Their abilities would be vastly different, and even their paths would be different. Naturally, it was impossible to rank them based on how far they had progressed. However, it was still possible to rank them based on their combat strength. Since the ranking was based on their combat achievements and combat strength, a small number of strange low-level individuals could also enter this rank based on their combat achievements, such as forbidden spell mages or low-level beast kings with ridiculously powerful beasts. These individuals would be ranked at 20 stars based on their combat strength, danger level. 5 stars was a benchmark for the true bodies of ordinary lesser gods. 10 stars was another benchmark for the true bodies of powerful gods. 20 stars still represented the pinnacle of the entire world. For the main gods, there was no point in going any higher than that. Just like how powerful semi-god individuals were capable of beating up weak gods, main gods were also capable of beating up powerful gods. Right now, in the early stages of the Holy War, the great majority of level surpassers were probably still below 3 stars. But I knew that as the Holy War progressed, semi-gods would be like dogs, and powerful individuals with more than 10 stars would be everywhere. As for whether or not a creator goddess with more than 30 stars would appear in the end, that was something nobody could guarantee. It was quite obvious that this change was to make it so that low-level individuals would no longer have any rights. Level surpassers at semi-god and above would have to be ranked differently. Perhaps the title level surpassers implied that they would look down on the high and mighty gods of the past. Perhaps an era where weak gods were like dogs was about to arrive. Level 1 nameless, Level 2 master, Level 3 legend, and Level 4 level surpassers. The new rankings brought new meaning, as well as new bounties. That's right, the contract hero system was now recognized by the entire world. Justice points had become a form of currency that was even more useful than the official government currency. And the dimensional invaders of different stars also represented tremendous amounts of wealth. Back in the day, the moon goddess and the god of fate had paid the price of lowering their own power levels in order to create a network created by starlight and fate that marked all dimensional invaders. Now, the system would give a fixed reward based on the enemy's strength and danger level. What? You can't pay? Are you sure you're not joking with me? In terms of money, or justice points, no job class could compare to mages who could cast forbidden spells. A single forbidden spell could freeze countless abyss demons for eternity. How much justice points would that be? My contract bracelet had already recorded my combat results. Now that I asked for justice points, I was actually rejected. The fairies in front of me were sweating profusely. They were known to appear and disappear unpredictably everywhere. They had already taken over the task of exchanging justice points for justice points. But no matter how he calculated, he discovered that no matter how much he calculated, Roland's request still exceeded the limit of what he had on hand. I'm sorry. I need to ask my superiors. The moment I discovered that I could move my arm again, I immediately went to find the exchange staff and requested that my justice points be exchanged as soon as possible. That was because, I'm sorry, Your Highness Roland. I just asked my superiors to make some adjustments to the exchange rules for justice points. The maximum reward for a single battle will be 200,000 justice points. The reward for killing demons and dimensional invaders of the same species will be greatly reduced. Another fairy jumped out and rambled on about a large number of changes. She skipped words, But her conclusion was that it was highly likely that she would receive millions or even tens of millions of justice points. She would receive at most 200,000 justice points in the future. But since you worked so hard to find a bug in my system, I'll give you a special reward, 21,000 justice points at most. Why does this sound so much like some unscrupulous video game developers, such as Big Q Goose or Big Snow Daddy? I felt rather helpless. I want to curse out loud, but I didn't know who to curse out loud. I had immediately requested to exchange justice points for justice points precisely because I was worried that this would happen. Yet, it just so happened that I was the one who had suggested the compensation system. Should I punch myself in the face? Policies would never be perfect. In order to prevent people from maliciously farming justice points, I suggested that as soon as an obvious loophole appeared, the system should be immediately amended and appropriate additional compensation would be given. What? This wasn't a loophole? Farming a large amount of justice points in one go wasn't a loophole? As long as it affected the stability of the entire system, no matter what the reason was, I would simply treat it as a loophole and deal with it. Indeed, no matter what the reason was, if I was truly given several tens of millions of justice points, I could directly exchange for a dozen or so god equipment to play around with. That would probably be enough to force some gods to commit suicide, and the entire system of justice points would naturally collapse. What did I mean by appropriate compensation? Yep, it's impossible to satisfy me no matter how many justice points I have, so I might as well give you a little something. I'll give you 1% or even 1/1000 of the original amount. When I recalled what I had originally said, I really wanted to slap myself in the face even more. It would seem that I had dug my own grave yet again. I didn't need to worry about those who had been scammed, rebelling, or causing trouble. Of course, I didn't need to worry about that at all. Back then, I used some of the contract from Earth as a reference. When I received my armlets, I would also have to sign a series of Dear Contract Hero System User, I am your father contracts guaranteed by the god of contracts, Womians. Not only could I not tell anyone about this, if I told anyone about this, it would cause a bad reputation effect, and I would even have to pay for it. I fell silent. Back then, when I drafted my own contract to fight for the throne, I used many classic contract from Earth as reference. There really weren't any loopholes that I could take advantage of. However, my family business was quite large, and my expenses were quite high as well. I was quite unwilling to let such a large sum of money fly away just like that. Actually, I have quite a good relationship with the higher-ups, especially the boss behind the Justice Point system. Perhaps I can have a chat with him. All right then, since I couldn't win against him in a contract, I might as well try a favor. Of course, I was quite familiar with the boss behind the Justice Point system. It was the entire Hades divine faction, including Womians, as well as all the related factions on the surface. The goddess of wealth was in charge of the finances, and Womians was the one who guaranteed authority. I could count myself as one of them as well, except that I didn't have to do anything and didn't receive any dividends. Actually, the boss behind the Justice Point system was the one who sent me here. His original words were, "Don't go overboard. I'll give you 200,000 justice points at most. That'll be enough for you to take what you want." Also, Her Highness Baena gave me her blessings. Don't go too overboard. I haven't even taken your commission yet. Cough if you go overboard, you know. Cough, cough, 200,000 it is. I interrupted her. First of all, I didn't even need to mention great god ALS understanding. If that petty goddess of wealth decided to hold a grudge against me, I didn't want to go through the experience of losing money every time I went out. I didn't know how I offended Baena, but the result was that I would lose money every time I went out, and my house would always be robbed. I had to change my diet, and in the end, I discovered that eating other people's food wouldn't trigger the curse of the poor god, so I shamelessly began to eat and drink for free. In the end, I was so poor that I had to go to Barton's bar to eat and drink for free. I've already told you many times. You won't be cursed at all. You're just too unlucky. Shut up. Nonsense. I'm only temporarily cursed. There's still hope for my life. At most, I'll really give Baena some commission. I'll donate some to the goddess of wealth to change my luck. Didn't the goddess of wealth's church forbid you from entering? Ever since you spent half a year there, idling around, eating and drinking until the gods were enraged and sent down divine punishment. You're the first one. Cough, cough. Let's forget about my dark history. After the Battle of the Hades, I didn't have any pressure or responsibilities while I was roaming the mortal plane. I had the happiest days of my life. However, my personal life, which was independent from my organization, exposed my lack of wealth and ability to live. Yep, for the sake of living, I did some shameless things. But Harlois, why are you bringing up my dark history again? Don't you want the bonuses I get from buying cosmetics? I wasn't the only one who wanted to use my fate points to exchange for some treasures. Harlois and my system were also eyeing my wallet. They had already prepared how they were going to sweep me clean at the end of the year. Right? According to our new system, you've been evaluated as a level 7, level 4. Based on your usual achievements and faction preferences, you're also allowed to spend money here. I wasn't surprised that I had such a high evaluation, although I indeed hadn't reached semi-god rank yet. Just my forbidden spells alone were far more destructive than the so-called gods. I chuckled when I heard that I could spend money here. I can spend money here? Give me another 100,000. The fairies wouldn't be like the gnomes who could spend money here and there. Of course, it would be a waste not to take out an interest-free loan. Your limit is 1,000 fate points. All right then, in the end, I still ended up with 21,000 fate points. So I'd already been seen through by others. But even though this was a small amount of fate points, it was still a tremendous amount of wealth. At the time, I only had a bounty of 50,000 fate points. Perhaps it wouldn't be enough to exchange for a custom-made god equipment. It wasn't on the list, but it would be more than enough to purchase the items I desperately needed. Dusk fruits, they're 5 years old. I recall that they're worth 500 fate points each. Let's exchange for 100 of them first. Even if it's a double diamond bloodline, that damn bloodline should be able to reach adulthood or even enter the prime of its life after 500 years. Also, help me check my inventory of Ancient Sword Saints martial arts manuals. I want to focus on ice magic. Spending money was always fun. My wallet would always become empty without me realizing it, especially since my shopping cart was already filled to the brim when I didn't have enough money to pay for it. Now that I had money in my account, I spent nearly 100,000 fate points to purchase dusk fruits, magical martial arts manuals that I personally needed, and so on. I wasn't trying to be frugal with the remaining fate points. Converting resources into actual combat strength as quickly as possible was my top priority. It was just that the items that I wanted would require time to gather. I would either purchase them from the national treasuries of the mortal plane or trade them with other gods. Right now, I could only purchase the treasures that were already in storage. At this moment, the airship fleet suddenly stopped and looked out the window. Finally, the sky was no longer covered in ice and snow. For the elves, the cruel migration had only just begun. Chapter 651. The Carrot Plains were currently a scene of winter desolation. The plains were already yellow and withered. Wolf packs were roaming the area in search of food. It was even possible to hear the roars of beasts nearby. However, compared to the glaciers that filled the sky not long ago, this place seemed like heaven. Not far behind us was the Hurrit Snow Mountain. When we turned around, we could see that the walls of ice pierced the clouds. It was impossible to see the end of the snow-covered mountain. Meanwhile, on the plains, the elves formed a grand caravan that slowly but resolutely advanced northward. Most of the elves had to walk. This grand caravan moved incredibly slowly. There weren't many horse carriages or large bird carriages. They were either heavily injured or filled with medicine, food, and other supplies. Ordinary lifeless items could still be stored in Yongya City. However, food and supplies that were meant to be eaten would likely transform into the undead if they were corroded by negative energy. Occasionally, there would be lightly injured people or children who were unable to walk anymore. They would be dragged away by others. Faint sounds of crying could be heard from the caravan. Perhaps this was because the survivors had been numbed by fear and despair. Now that they were finally in a safe area, they couldn't help but feel the pain of losing their homes and loved ones. Even though the airship fleet was slowly advancing in the sky, and cannons were already chasing away any wild beast that approached the caravan, The elves' flying horses and hippogriffs night were still flying in the clouds. Even though these flying hippogriffs and their mounts were all injured, perhaps they wanted to find some work to do so that they wouldn't think too much and drown in sorrow and despair. Perhaps the destruction of the elven gods would be something that all species in the mortal plane would love to see. It would also be the best choice for the elves who remained in the mortal plane. However, for the ordinary elves, it was meaningless to look too far ahead. They were nothing more than war refugees who had just lost their homes and kin. They were only crying because they had lost everything in the past. The entire caravan was faintly enveloped in a gray, sorrowful atmosphere. Endless sounds of crying and sighing could be heard. However, we had no intentions of interfering. If we couldn't release our sorrow, it would only become even more trouble in the future. Perhaps the demons had already completed their first goal, or perhaps the elven gods were unexpectedly perfect sacrifices, or perhaps the demon wave was far more chaotic than we had expected. But soon, the fairies' latest battle report told us the truth. The greedy demon wave was currently enjoying a new prey. The Devon dukedom has been destroyed in just one day. More accurately speaking, it took 18 hours and 40 minutes for the demon wave to cross the border to Nades, breaking through the capital's gates. Although Nades was only a small country with 3 cities and a population of nearly 1 million, it was indeed destroyed far faster than expected. It would seem that even after the elves were exhausted, the demon wave and Nades were still far beyond what any ordinary small country would be capable of dealing with. And if I recalled correctly, that country had rejected our previous request to travel to Nades in order to avoid bringing trouble upon themselves. However, the result was the same. I lay on the bed, trying to focus on the view outside the window, but is there any new intelligence or government affairs that need to be handled? Is there any news about the demon abyss in the north? There's no new news from the northern lands, but probably because of the outbreak of war, the average price of winter grain inland has increased by 30% in just 2 days. The noise in my ears and the passionate gazes made me reluctantly give up on ignoring the other people in the room and focus on hiding. Renee, can't you just let the patient have a good rest? I was currently lying in the Borealis medical room, still unable to move. The room was filled with the smell of medicinal herbs and alchemy pills, which were used to replenish the energy I had expended after casting a forbidden spell, compared to the holy light, which was even more draining on one's life force. I preferred natural treatments that were slow to take effect but didn't have any side effects. Meanwhile, the bandage therapy, which was infused with mana recovery potions, was a secret technique for healing mana overdraft. The small medical room was actually already filled with work desks. Renee unceremoniously chose to work here. Her concubine, Ivy Marceau from the Swallow Federation, was also here to handle government affairs. Early in the morning, Renee had brought her government team here to work. Considering how she was more hardworking than I was, but her work style was limited, it was likely that she was trying to find someone to shift the blame to. I know that you're very busy. Go to your captain's room. What's the meaning of disturbing a patient's rest? Even if you tied yourself up like a mummy, that doesn't mean that you're truly injured. The doctor said that you're completely capable of handling government affairs. If you have the time to read a mechanical repair manual, why don't you do something else instead? For instance, give us some advice. By the way, you're reading that Dwarven Mechanical Repair manual upside down. I hurriedly flipped the manual over, but the little girl giggled secretly, telling me that I had accidentally been tricked. That's right. How could I possibly understand engineering? Although I knew some Dwarven language, I wouldn't be able to understand a mechanical repair manual that was filled with engineering terms. I was pretending to be focused on reading the manual only to find an excuse to refuse to do any work. I helplessly tossed aside the manual. It would indeed be quite unsightly for me to continue at this point. Yet, I still muttered something under my breath. You've all done well these past few years. You've long since become independent. Why do you still need old bones like us? We should have retired long ago. My complaints weren't drowned out. Renee directly shook her head when she heard me. At the very least, you should know about the recent changes in the Northlands. Also, you're a true prophet. It would be such a waste if I didn't squeeze you a little. Ask you a little. Profit? Oh, so I've been taken seriously when I tricked the Gentleman Alliance back in the day. Still, in a way, I did indeed have the ability to predict history. However, history had changed so much already that there weren't many things that could be predicted anymore. Don't count on me too much, especially when it's something related to the Northlands. Prophecies aren't real at all as long as they involve the prophet's own actions. I'm too deeply involved with the Northlands. Even I can't tell you anything. This wasn't pure nonsense. The history of the Northlands' holy war back in the day was far more pitiful than it was now. Without me and Cavendish, the Mist Kingdom wouldn't have been revived, nor would the Mist Alliance have been established. After the ancient Mist Kingdom was destroyed, the strongest beastmen in the Northlands directly occupied that land. 300 years was more than enough for the beastmen to completely occupy the Northlands. They cooperated with the Underground to counterattack and defeat the Northlands' Moon Kingdom of the Elves. In fact, they even received historical praise for the beastmen's revival. It wasn't until the demons swept through the entire mortal plane that the Northlands' beastmen's final glory days were ended. I wasn't lying. The historical development of the Northlands had far too much to do with me. It had long since changed beyond recognition. So what could I possibly prophesize? Perhaps it was because my believe it or not believe it won't work. You can prophesize others, but you can't prophesize yourself sounded too much like a wandering fortune teller on the streets. The little girl from the Swallow Federation immediately laughed out loud. Her smiling expression made it obvious that she didn't believe me at all. However, Renee trusted me far too much as usual. When she heard that my refusal wasn't very firm, she giggled and took advantage of the situation. Then that means you've agreed to help us. Katie, continue with your report. And so, that middle-aged government official with a pockmarked face continued his report. The increase in winter grain prices has exceeded the danger level of 30% in just a few short days. There's already a panic buying frenzy within the Mist Alliance. The Mist Alliance's logistics department head's opinion is that we still have plenty of food reserves and that all the countries should open up their national coffers to balance the prices of food in order to calm everyone down. Although the current Mist Alliance was an alliance composed of several dozen countries, the people of the Mist were far too important. Renee's words carried tremendous weight. Even if all the countries had already reached a consensus, they would still have to rely on this uncrowned ruler to make the final decision. I've checked the data on the food reserves. Based on the current consumption rate, it should be no problem for us to harvest next autumn. Ivy Marceau's father was the Swallow Federation's member of parliament. Ivy Marceau had been raised to be the descendant of a politician since she was young. Now, she was helping Renee deal with government affairs with the status of a concubine. She was doing her best. Seeing that everyone was nodding in agreement, and that Renee was about to agree as well, I finally couldn't bear to watch any longer. Don't even talk about producing food now. We should open up all the warehouses and do our best to harvest food. The moment I said this, I overturned the government decree that was about to be made. All the government officials in the room looked at me with obvious dissatisfaction and displeasure. Perhaps it was because I was in front of the emperor that they didn't immediately retort. If my inference is correct, food prices are going to skyrocket for a long period of time. Haven't you all seen the latest news? San Antonio, the #1 food exporter in all of Ike, has been dragged into the holy war. As long as San Antonio's emperor doesn't have a screw loose in his head, next year's food exports will be greatly reduced, even if not zero. It's only natural that food prices will skyrocket. The San Antonio Empire occupied what used to be the Beastmen's holy land of origin. It was said that any wheat that was scattered there would be harvested the next year in the Golden Plains. Not only would the San Antonio Empire produce enough food every year, the surplus would naturally be exported. Even if the Holy War wouldn't affect San Antonio's food production areas, the San Antonio Empire's agricultural exporting countries would have an excess of food reserves even if they had enough food for themselves. It was only natural that San Antonio's food exports would be greatly reduced in the coming year. We've already considered this. However, most of our food imports are from the Bardi Empire and the Ottoman Empire. Even if food prices are affected, that's within expectations. We can deal with it. As Renee's chief support officer, Ivy, who had a special status, didn't even try to hide her dissatisfaction with my judgment. Judging from the other government officials' expressions, they all agreed with Ivy's judgment as well. I was rendered speechless. It wasn't that I was convinced. It was that I didn't know how to explain how evil humans were, how unscrupulous merchants would eat people, and how a large number of unscrupulous merchants were waiting to profit from war and national disasters. It was also difficult to explain that no matter how much they predicted the Holy War, they had all underestimated the Holy War's intensity and duration. As long as the Holy War dragged on, food prices would naturally multiply. Although the Northlands now had several excellent cold-resistant crops thanks to Amelia's assistance, when considering the Northlands' weather and barren land, as well as the rapidly increasing population after the misalliance was established, there would still be a significant food shortage every year, even though the Northlands had been promoting cold-resistant crops. Of course, this was something that could be solved. The cold-resistant wheat that Amelia had chosen in the end looked rather similar to piranha flowers and tasted rather strange and earthy, but it wasn't a magical plant. It was harmless and wouldn't kill anyone who ate it. Although the planting conditions in the Northlands were too poor, there was plenty of uncultivated land and labor in the Northlands. As long as the planting area increased and the food production increased, it would be possible to reach a balance. The rich who disliked the monotonous taste and imbalanced nutrition would naturally be able to purchase food from other places. For the Mist Alliance's officials, being picky about food was far too extravagant. It was already a tremendous achievement in history that the Northland's barren lands didn't starve to death. Everyone knew that this was a major event. For the past 8 years, the number of young people who applied to become farmers was the greatest honor. The number of fields around the cities had increased exponentially, and the Northland's food production had increased exponentially as well. It was precisely this exponential increase in food production that caused the Northland's officials to misjudge the future. They felt that as long as the Northland's food supply could be maintained for a while, they would be able to reach a balance. However, I knew that the Holy War wouldn't give them an easy time. As long as the Mist Alliance required food imports, the Northlands countries would need to stockpile food on a large scale. Perhaps when the Holy War reached its climax, there wouldn't be any food on the international market anymore. I fell silent for a moment as I organized my words. How can you guarantee that the Bardi Empire and the Ottoman Empire won't get involved in the Holy War in the coming year? How is that possible? Ivy stopped mid-sentence in surprise. She wanted to say that common sense didn't allow for such a coincidence, but then she recalled that nobody would be able to guarantee such a thing. Nobody would be able to predict the Holy War's progress. Besides, perhaps you haven't experienced the chaos of a world war before. In such a situation, if a grain-producing country has a problem, it'll have a psychological impact on the entire international food market. Other countries will start purchasing food instead of exporting it. It's quite predictable that the international food price will increase. In fact, it's even possible that there's no market for food, even if there's a price. The more I thought about it, the more I felt that it was possible. There were no international organizations in this world that could maintain the balance of the world. If those international merchants and agents with country backgrounds really started to increase the price of food, it was quite possible that food would become even more expensive than gold. Yep, then it's decided. This year, we'll purchase food instead of selling it. Renee made her decision quite directly. However, Ivy became anxious. But there's a shortage of food in the domestic food market. The lack of winter food will affect people's morale and cause panic. Renee looked towards me, and I shrugged. I was quite skilled at dealing with such things, but it definitely wouldn't be something that would ensure peace and prosperity. Would you believe that the price will increase by 30% in 2 days without any unscrupulous merchants selling their goods? Just search all of those unscrupulous merchants and take out all of their stored goods to balance the prices. Right? If it's difficult for you to deal with this, just leave it to the Dark Elves. They're all experts, and I guarantee that they'll be able to catch anyone they want. If they catch any one of them, they'll even explain everything to their ancestors. Obviously, this wasn't a normal method of dealing with such a situation. Casually searching the properties of wealthy merchants would only cause the merchants to panic. Perhaps the merchants would choose to relocate and transfer their wealth, which would cause endless problems in the long run. However, it's already wartime. Using peacetime methods will only cause those unscrupulous merchants to look down on you. Killing a chicken to warn the monkeys is better than constantly causing trouble in the future. Heh, the feudal era is so convenient. You don't even need to find evidence when searching for property. My overly intense method of dealing with the situation caused Renee to nod as if she understood something. She knew that I wasn't a bloodthirsty person. In fact, it could even be said that I was tired of killing. However, there was naturally a reason why I was using such an extreme method at such a time. She could guess some of it as well. The Northlands will also face war. Since this was a time of war, it was understandable that I would be using such an extreme method. I laughed at Renee's question. She was still too young and underestimated the holy war that was about to engulf the entire mortal plane. No, it's not that the Northlands is about to face war. It's that the entire world is already at war. Every species, every country, every region, and every individual will be able to face the test of war. You die, perhaps I die, or perhaps we both die in the final holy war. Since I had already said something so shocking, I didn't care about their reactions. It didn't matter if they believed me or treated me as nonsense. However, since I had already said it, I was rather interested. Brat, continue reporting. Let me see how you juniors are doing. Chapter 652. The small infirmary had now been transformed into an administrative office. Most of the time, I only listened in. It had been so many years since I left the Northlands, and I was still rather unfamiliar with the new Mist Alliance. It would obviously be foolish to casually give my opinion on something I wasn't sure about. However, the more I listened, the more I frowned. The problem of Wintergrain was not a big one, but it was not a small one either. Even if they made a mistake this time, they could make up for it when they realized that the situation was not right. Even if they had to work harder next year, and the treasury would be empty for a period of time, it would not create an impression that they could not make up for it. But what made me feel like something was off was a certain concept that was gradually accepted by the Northlanders. There's nothing to be afraid of in the Holy War. We'll be victorious in a few years. If a person's life was too smooth, they would naturally become filled with confidence. If a country's life was too smooth, its citizens would also become overly optimistic. For the past 8 years, the Mist Alliance had indeed been having far too smooth of a time. It had gone from being a fringe faction to becoming the center of attention at an astonishing speed. It was understandable that it would be overly optimistic. People always like to compare the past in order to emphasize their current advantages. Some optimists believe that humans have been able to deal with the last holy war with metal weapons. Holy light, magic, and other supernatural powers were incredibly rare in human society. But now, not only did we surpass the elves in magic, we even had new technology and a tremendous population. This was basically using magical engineering technology to fight against primitive humans. How could we possibly lose? No matter how much those superiors emphasized the cruelty of the Holy War, they would always slack off in their hearts. In fact, even those superiors who emphasized the cruelty of the Holy War weren't really vigilant. As for me, the Holy War is easy to deal with. Could it be done in a few years? This is the final Holy War, a final battle to the death without any rules. It's highly likely that it won't end even after several decades or centuries. Perhaps there won't even be a final victor. Perhaps every single resident of the mortal plane will be at war every single day after the demon wave begins. Perhaps the children of the future won't even know what peace is. This was no exaggeration. In the game's history, before the Mana Tide broke out and the world was destroyed, countless planes and all of Aichi were burning in flames. It was an eternal war with no hope, an endless night without dawn. Once the restrictions of the Abyss were lifted, no one could predict what the final eruption would be like. Perhaps some people would say that the Chaos Abyss only had 12 main god-level existences, and that the difference between them wasn't that obvious. However, The truth was that the Chaos Abyss was where the countless losers of the eternal Holy War ended up. Nobody knew what else was hidden there. Not to mention others, even the original main God-level sun god and the most ancient demon who invented death magic weren't on the list of the 12 main gods. However, I reckon that their actual power levels might even surpass several of the main gods. The endless Chaos Abyss represented endless dimensions and countless losers. Once all restrictions were removed, all losers would have a chance to become victors. Just thinking about what would happen in the end was frightening. Indeed, the mortal plane was one of the most fertile planes blessed by the gods. But if the innumerable mortal planes started to invade the mortal plane at the same time, I had no confidence in how long the mortal plane would be able to last. That was why my general strategy from the very start had been to defend my country and contact our allies. We would first survive for a period of time when the Chaos Abyss was strong, and then develop our technology and warriors during this difficult time. Only then would we plan a counterattack. But judging from the current situation, these youngsters probably wanted to fight a painful battle against the Chaos Abyss. The number of youngsters joining the army this year has already exceeded our expectations. The various countries' armies have decided to open up an additional 20 combat squads. That means that the number of people who volunteered to join the army has already exceeded our expectations by nearly 100,000. Although the young government official before me seemed fatigued, his face was glowing red. He was also quite excited as he spoke, as if he was excited about the excellent situation in the country. Indeed, when a country was about to face a war, the youngsters of the country would still enthusiastically join the army. Apart from proving the citizens' trust in the country, it also meant that the citizens believed that joining the army was a good path. The youngsters who desired to become warriors believed that they and their country would survive this crisis, and that they would obtain glory and benefits from the war. At such a time, I wouldn't be so tactless as to say, are these children so eager to die? Since the cruel test was right in front of us, it was better to be a bit more confident. Even if it was overconfidence, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. As a veteran mastermind behind the scenes, rather than telling the citizens about the harsh reality and causing panic and distrust, it would be better to transform this blind confidence into something beneficial, and then think of a way to obtain victory. Even if they would still have to face the cruel reality in the end. At the very least, they would be able to confidently survive through this difficult period, which would already be worth it. However, the citizens could be overly optimistic, and the young soldiers could be overly optimistic. However, the government leaders and military commanders definitely couldn't be overly optimistic. The more important, it was to remain clear-headed during critical periods. Overly optimistic attitudes could lead to overly optimistic assumptions about the situation, and a single wrong policy could lead to a series of problems. It seems that I need to gather all these people together and give them a scare. Renee was all smiles when she heard that the situation in the country was excellent. She kept nodding and glancing at me proudly from time to time, as if she was bragging about her achievements, saying, "I did quite well, didn't I?" I also smiled and nodded as if I was praising her. However, I was actually rather displeased. Forget about everyone else, but you understand demons so well, yet you're still so optimistic despite being a leader? It seems that you really need to be taught a lesson. Let's start with being a politician and ensure that you don't reveal your true emotions at all times. In that case, let's start with drinking 100% strong chili water and maintaining a smile. My mind was filled with vicious schemes, yet the more I smiled, the happier I became. The atmosphere in the room was quite peaceful, as if I also felt that the situation was excellent. You haven't told Renee about the future either, have you? In fact, you haven't even told me about it. Harlow's words surprised me. In that case, I indeed hadn't shared any detailed information about the future with anyone else. In that case, I couldn't blame Renee for being overly optimistic. I haven't told her about it, but I've always been doing it. If I'm truly outstanding, she should be able to see my expectations for the future from my actions. Don't make things difficult for me. Who can possibly guess what an old fox like you is thinking? I'm only barely able to guess your plans because I know your predictions. Are you intending to give up on the continent and defend the Northlands? Being so pessimistic and passive isn't your style. Harlow's words echoed in my ears. I looked at Renee and smiled as she nodded. As expected, she giggled foolishly. Only then did I reply to Harlow's through our soul connection. Yes, but how did you know? The undead Shua Empire is moving northwards. The Church of Law is moving northwards. The Dark Elves in Dragon City are also beginning to move northwards. The Goddess of Wealth and the other Hades are also beginning to move northwards. This should be your suggestion, right? I nodded again. Renee was giggling foolishly again, while Ivy was glaring at me. Well, had I ever offended her? Since the demon wave had arrived, things would develop as I expected. Perhaps it was time for me to draw out my blueprint for the future. Chapter 653. My script. In front of the tides of the Chaos Abyss, unite all the countries and form an unbreakable alliance. Exchange technology and resources with each other, and step into a new era of great development in magic and magical engineering. Finally, we'll be ahead of the entire generation in terms of technology, creating a wave of revolution that will chase the Chaos Abyss back to where it came from. Fine, I admit that all of that was nonsense. I had mentioned this a long time ago, and this was what I had always believed as well. In the tides of changing times, individual power was minuscule. In fact, it could even be said that individual power was ignored. All I can do is plant some seeds, and then pray that these seeds will grow into towering trees that will change some of the pitiful futures. I risked everything for the rise of the Hades faction, but that didn't mean that the Hades faction would be able to directly fight against the Chaos Abyss. It was just that the existence of the Hades prevented the goddesses of chaos and chaos from waking up. As for everything else, I never even considered that. When you're about to be expelled from school, will you consider what you're going to do for homework tomorrow? Perhaps that wasn't an appropriate analogy, so let's change it to, when you're certain that you're going to be sent to the guillotine tomorrow, will you care about what you're going to have for dinner tonight? Although I'm experienced in dying, so I'll probably care about whether or not there's going to be meat for dinner, most people will probably be too nervous to eat. Cough. I couldn't blame myself for not being able to see far into the future. Originally, creating the Hades faction and breaking the creator goddess's monopoly on the cycle of reincarnation was already an impossible miracle. Now that I and the Chaos Abyss had truly achieved this, I finally had the time to look at the new future that we had grasped after our initial excitement and confusion. The worst-case scenario of total annihilation has indeed changed, but the difference in power between the Chaos Abyss and the Chaos Abyss hasn't changed at all. Due to Cynthia's divine concealment, the Chaos Abyss without any restrictions will be far more difficult to deal with than in the game's history. Although the general trend of history sounded quite scary, it was actually just the difference in power level between the Chaos Abyss and the Chaos Abyss. For example, if there were no other objective factors, and there was a burly, fully armed man bullying an unarmed, skinny boy, no matter what he did, he would still end up being beaten to the ground due to the massive difference in size. This was the so-called general trend. But now, the Chaos faction was dealing with that large man, while the HE plane was dealing with that skinny brat. Not only that skinny brat was still scheming against each other, and didn't even take his opponent seriously. No matter how one looked at it, it seemed that Roland would be beaten to the ground. In the game's history, in the early stages of the Holy War, the Order faction was beaten to the ground by the Chaos faction. In the middle stages, the Order faction was still beaten to the ground. In the later stages, the Order faction also got used to being beaten to the ground. War was the embodiment of overall strength. The fact that every Chaos faction citizen was a soldier meant that the Chaos faction's new magical engineering technology was indeed a lifesaver for the Chaos faction. However, it would still take time for it to grow into a towering tree. Since the overall combat strength of the Chaos faction and the Chaos faction hadn't fundamentally changed, no matter how one looked at it, the Chaos faction and the Chaos faction would still end up being beaten to a pulp in the early stages of the Holy War. Defending and counterattacking, war of attrition, traveling behind enemy lines, trading space for time, All these so-called strategies sounded quite impressive, but the premise was that the Chaos faction wouldn't be able to defeat the Chaos faction head-on. These were all methods that had no other solution. It wasn't as if the HE plane had no chance of victory. Their magical engineering technology, as well as their many years of accumulation and potential as the ruler of the Chaos faction, would gradually show their true potential in the later stages of the Holy War. In the game's history, countless heroes had appeared. However, in the early stages of the Holy War, most people would be woken up by the cruel reality of the Chaos faction. They would be terrified and would be willing to risk everything to participate in this life and death battle. I was no saint. I didn't have the ability to create something out of nothing. So-called strategies and schemes were ultimately still based on how one played chess pieces, how one scammed outside of the chessboard. When the difference in chess pieces between two sides was so great that it was impossible to play, and when the Chaos faction directly crushed the Chaos faction, no matter how hard one thought, rather than thinking about how to defeat the Chaos faction's legendary opponent, it would be far more practical to think about how to lose as little as possible. That way, they would be able to preserve as many seeds as possible for the Chaos faction's counterattack. The Northlands will band together and survive the winter together until the entire Ike continent enters its counterattack period. If there's no counterattack period, then we'll just persevere for as long as we can. It was extremely passive and short-sighted. In fact, if I said it out loud right now, people would think that I was a coward. Yet, this was the strategy that I had chosen in the end, as I had always liked to create opportunities for myself. Even though I'm clearly the weaker side, I'm still going all out to attack the Chaos faction. But after the fun is over, I'll probably just have to type GG. Facing the Chaos faction's opponent in a location of their own choosing is the most basic strategy. As an experienced mastermind behind the scenes, I didn't need to mention my strategy that would definitely be criticized and attacked. All I needed to do was make preparations and wait for the Ike continent situation to worsen. The Northlanders would naturally make the decision I wanted them to make. In my opinion, choosing the Northlands as the final base of operations was indeed the best choice. Perhaps this was a barren land, the border of the entire world. However, the other side of being barren and marginalized was that before other rich lands were snatched and occupied, no one would be interested in this remote and desolate land, especially when the Northlands were not easy to conquer. Perhaps this was a land of ice and snow in the far north. Since the great majority of Chaos Abyss demons were born with the fire element and were resistant to fire, this land of ice would be the best natural barrier. No living creature would have an easy time in this land of ice. The low temperature would bring a series of problems for physical creatures. Only the undead would be able to display extraordinary combat strength here. The moment we encountered a demon army, the ice and snow of the Northlands would become our natural ally. Besides, this wasn't like 8 years ago. It wasn't as if there was nothing here. The Northlands was no longer the borderland it had been 8 years ago. Allying with the Northland's kingdom of the elves meant that rich plains and forests had been integrated into the Northlands. Allying with the Northland's beastmen also meant that the Northlands now had powerful ice resources and combat potential. Allying with the underground meant that it would be impossible to cut off the Northland's connection to the outside world. And the Shillua Empire's northward migration gave the Northlands the foundational strength of a mega-empire. The Shillua Empire, the Underground, and the People of the Mist were now the iron triangle of the Northland's Mist Alliance. This triangular alliance wasn't just for military and political reasons. When large numbers of gray dwarves and goblin craftsmen entered the Northlands magical and ordinary ores had already been mined in large amounts. And with the Shillua Empire's participation, the Northlands' enchantment and industrial development greatly improved. Plus, the Northlands was the birthplace of magical engineering technology. Every year, the Northlands arms trade would attract the attention of the entire world. The various Hades faction churches entering the Northlands meant that the gods were taking care of the Northlands. In this world, this also meant that there would be stable divine concepts and high-level job class members. This also meant that the Northlands would have powerful high-level combat strength, as well as the people's stability. The Northlands' human kingdoms alone were nothing more than border residents. The underground factions alone were only powerful overlords for a time. The Northlands' elves alone were nothing more than turtles that lacked courage and initiative. The Northlands' beastmen alone were nothing more than injured beasts with broken teeth and ambitions. The undead alone were nothing more than the entire world's common enemy of the living. But when we all allied together, we complemented each other's weaknesses. A mega faction capable of sustaining itself was gradually maturing and rising. Some things were obvious. Perhaps it was because the Mist Alliance's situation had been far too good over the past few years. Now that other countries were beginning to show respect to the Northlands' winter wolves, the Mist Alliance's citizens and higher-ups were indeed feeling rather smug. But once war broke out and the mega-countries and Ike entered a bitter battle, all the Northlands factions would band together for warmth. Everything would develop exactly as I had described. The entire Northlands will be separated from the rest of the world and become a gigantic fortress of ice and snow. The moment we're invaded, this endless land of ice and snow will become a natural city wall. Powerful industries and magical industries will transform into potential for war. Northlanders who don't fear death will be the best warriors in all of HE. The Mist War flag represents the guarded land that will become the Chaos Abyss's nightmare. Not only that, there were many other factors that the world didn't understand in this familiar land that I could make use of. These factors would increase the chances of victory in defensive battles, as well as deal with the gods who overstepped their boundaries. Of course, there were still many deficiencies in this land. The most obvious one was the lack of food. The humans didn't even have enough food for themselves. The Northlands beastmen didn't even have enough food for themselves by hunting. The elves had food, but it was likely that they wouldn't even have enough food for themselves. The underground's top-quality food had always been a valuable strategic resource. The specialty was all sorts of mushrooms that didn't require sunlight. As for the undead, I should probably forget about it. Even if I tried to promote new crops in the Northlands, the land was too barren and the yield per moo wouldn't increase. Self-sufficiency would definitely take some time. Even I wanted to go to the nature faction and kidnap more drool and wood elves. I did tell Amelia that I wanted to move some wood spirits here, but she unhesitatingly refused. The reason was that this land was far too cold and barren. Magical forests and magical plants hated this type of land the most. Large numbers of magical plants would immediately go dormant in such an environment, and it would be difficult for their seeds to even germinate. It would be possible to try if there was a warm and fertile land. The Northlands elves' territory was perfect for the elves' requirements. I had sent people to investigate, but the problem was that the Northlands elves' territory was like spring all year round, forcefully created by magic arrays. The elven gods had also participated in this process. Now that the elven gods were finished, even if the balance of nature didn't collapse, they would definitely be unable to accept moving to a forest of dreams that required natural conditions. All right then, this problem was temporarily unsolvable. The only thing I could do was probably to use international trade to collect as much food as possible while it was still possible. The other problem was probably the population problem. The Northlands was quite vast. However, the natural environment was quite harsh, so most ordinary citizens chose to live in relatively safe and warm medium or large cities. This was a typical example of a vast land with few people. Compared to the relatively safe mega-empires that had farms and villages everywhere, it was quite obvious that the Northlands lacked human resources. However, this problem was actually quite easy to solve. Or perhaps it should be said that it didn't need to be solved at all. As long as the war continued, a large number of refugees would naturally move to a relatively safe area. This was already proven by reality. The Mist Alliance's population was constantly increasing every year. Compared to dying in war, being slightly colder and poorer really wasn't a big deal at all. There was also the fact that the Mist Alliance's industries were far too weak. In this magical fantasy world, industries could be divided into two categories. One was the unnatural and magic-related industries, such as enchantments and alchemy. The other was blacksmithing and engineering industries. Magical industries required the accumulation of time and history. Skilled craftsmen required resources and good teachers. Even engineering equipment required large amounts of machinery and raw materials to produce. The Mist Alliance placed great importance on this aspect. However, it was obvious that this would require the accumulation of time and resources. Some technologies and magical secrets weren't for sale to begin with. Even if one had money, they wouldn't be able to buy them. Hopefully, the elves joining the Mist Alliance would be able to slightly improve these problems. It was also worth mentioning that many forest dwarves and elven craftsmen were in the Mist Alliance's caravan. Perhaps if they could devour the elves' most noble tribe of elves, which had accumulated over tens of thousands of years, they would be able to fundamentally improve these problems. The Mist Alliance had developed far too quickly. There were many internal problems, but the most critical ones were their low population, lack of food, and weak industries. However, these were all problems that could be solved. Of course, choosing to defend the borders didn't mean that the Mist Alliance would completely give up on the continent. A lone fortress would eventually be broken through. Only with external reinforcements would the Mist Alliance be safe. The Mist Alliance had an iron triangle. Actually, there's also an iron triangle alliance between the various countries. The Mist Alliance, Ottoman Empire, and Bardi Empire. These three countries were all powerful and had a solid foundation. Most importantly, they didn't have any conflicts of interest. In fact, they even complemented each other's interests. Not only that, they were all mega empires that still had mobile forces to support their allies, even in the face of war. However, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing for the Ottoman Empire after experiencing such a long war with the Sea Tribe. The Ottoman Empire's industries had long since been prepared for war. The long war with the Sea Tribe had greatly improved their country's shipbuilding industry. The Ottoman Empire was already the world's leading shipbuilding industry to begin with. With China's help, the Ottoman Empire's shipbuilding industry had reached an unbelievable level. It was said that Holland was now able to launch 30 large airships and over 100 medium-sized airships every 2 years. As floating airship technology matured, it was only natural that these surface airships would be modified into floating airships. Holland already possessed the strongest and most numerous floating airship fleets in the entire world even before the game's history. Moreover, it could be expected that as long as the war did not end, the scale of this fleet would become even more ridiculous. Considering the wealth and national power accumulated over several generations, the quasi-mega empire Ottoman Empire had unknowingly become a true mega-empire. These airships had also become the enforcers of the alliance between the three nations. The import and export of food, minerals, weapons, and ammunition were all dependent on them. This highly mobile fleet was also the most trustworthy reinforcement force. As an established mega-empire, the Bardi Empire wasn't far behind either. After Dragon Knight, Archduke Helent, who was a descendant of dragons, became the Dragon Knight Emperor, the relationship between the dragons and the Bardi Empire became even better. This was a coincidence of the times, but it was also the result of the decision made by the wise in advance. Facing the Holy War, the surface dragons had to make a decision. They needed to ally with the surface factions to overcome this difficult time, and the Bardi Empire, which was also part of their species, became the best choice. The current Bardi Empire was fully supported by the dragons. Dragons could be seen in the sky at any time, and Helent himself had become the representative of the dragons. The foolish king's inconceivable choice of a new ruler had achieved an inconceivable success. Naturally, the Bardi Empire also obtained the strongest aerial strength in the world, an organized Dragon Knight squadron. Also, I heard from a secret source that the Southern Sect had obtained angel squadrons, angels and dragons. It was likely that the Bardi Empire's aerial strength would be the strongest in the alliance between the three countries. Of course, the Mist Alliance also had its own aerial strength. Due to Bardi's pitiful shipbuilding skills, the new Borealis airship fleet was indeed lacking in numbers compared to the Bardi Empire's airships. The young black dragons and red dragons were also inferior to the Bardi Empire's old dragons and ancient dragons. However, the Aurora Knight Frigid Maw was still the strongest human aerial knight squadron. As the ice elemental plane strengthened, their numbers also increased exponentially every year. However, these ice knights could only display their strongest combat strength in the snowy Northlands, which was indeed rather embarrassing. However, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing when it came to defensive warfare. Also, the Mist Alliance's strongest aerial strength wasn't their regular combat strength. Perhaps I, who was currently in the medical room, was also counted as one of the major countries' true combat strength after I cast my forbidden spell. The powerful aerial forces of the three countries could be said to stand at the peak of the entire human world. This was also the foundation for a strategic alliance to play a practical role. The alliance between a small country and a large country was only the rule of the strong over the weak. The three countries were powerful enough, and they could support each other in the air. This was the foundation for the mutual assistance agreement to be fulfilled. Internally, there was an iron triangle. Of course, with the addition of the Elven Empire, it would likely become an iron triangle. Externally, there was an agreement between the three countries to help each other and defend the Northlands for the future. I'd already done everything that I could. If we still couldn't survive this calamity, then I had nothing more to say. Some things were laid out on the table, but some things were only left unwritten. However, Rene's marriage to Halen's younger sister was one of the most important parts of this strategy. In the era of the feudal dictatorship, what better way to express the closeness of the alliance than the marriage between the royal families? Marrying off his most beloved younger sister to a woman would mean that she wouldn't be able to enter the royal family's genealogy. Yet, the mega empire Bardi was willing to do such a ridiculous and even humiliating thing. This doubtlessly displayed Bardi Emperor Halen's sincerity and determination towards the alliance. If it wasn't for the fact that the Ottoman royalty had been completely wiped out by that lone wolf emperor, and that Halen himself was infatuated with his own queen and refused to take any concubines, a marriage alliance with the Ottoman Empire would have been inevitable. Meanwhile, I was currently watching Rene and her concubine Ivy's harmonious interactions. Although I was smiling happily on the surface, I was actually scheming something in my mind. Marrying her will have no actual relationship with her, and there won't be any descendants. Yet, she won't be dissatisfied. Rene is truly amazing as a pretty boy. How about I arrange a few more political marriages for her? This seems to be a good thing for both the people and the people. Yep, for the sake of the people of the Mist and the Mist Alliance, I'll let her become a prince of 100 tribes. Chapter 654, Asalivis, or Aso's Land of Eternal Rest in Undead language. This area was famous for being the place where the first undead Emperor Aso had perished. 8 years later, this place gained another name, the Undead Capital. That year, Aso decisively sacrificed himself, and this place became a place connected to the Undead Plains. During the past 8 years, the Undead Plains, Bone Plain, Ice Plain, Desecration Plain, Blood Plain, Darkness Plain, and Death Mist Plain, kept sending reinforcements to this place, gradually transforming it into the largest undead capital in the world. The entire area was now covered in the dimensional laws of death. Bone giants that were several hundred meters tall walked slowly on the plains, while gargoyles and bone dragons fought against each other in the sky. But actually, people didn't view this place as the most dangerous forbidden zone. In fact, from a certain standpoint, this place had even become a famous tourist attraction. That was because Asalivis had a lush green forest as far as the eye could see. That forest was the main headquarters of the Silver Suns, the Wood Spirits, who were incredibly popular in the mortal plane. Even outside of the forest, there were mountain-like, twin-headed treants patrolling the area. They wielded heaven-reaching sticks, and in the sky, there were also bizarrely styled wooden battleships constantly flying back and forth. From a certain standpoint, these seemingly idle wild monsters were actually all at least at the master or legend rank. Both sides had fought against each other for so many years, but this battlefield had always been jokingly referred to as the newbies' village. Very few veteran contract heroes would choose to train here. The reason? Even though the intensity of the battle here wasn't that high, and it was rather suspicious that the battle was rigged. Actually, both sides were still hostile toward each other. It was just that no matter how many resources were invested in a battle that was impossible to win, it would be a waste. After the previous major battles, the situation had changed greatly. The wood spirits had already matured, and the Forest of Dreams was now impossible to break through. Asalivis was the most important entrance to the 6 undead planes, so the Tark Republic's powerful undead lords were willing to pay any price to protect it. It wasn't that no hero had tried to threaten Asalivis' safety, but in times of real danger, a tremendous number of high-level undead and powerful spells would be thrown out of the dimensional door. Since the undead emperors were determined to protect this dimensional door at all costs, forceful invasions were viewed as impossible. And even if they managed to clear out all the undead and undead in the dimensional door, it would be impossible to close the dimensional door with Asalivis' life. Naturally, nobody wanted to fight a battle where there was no progress. The Tark Republic would never be able to recover before the Day of Destiny. The undead were also patiently waiting. Most of the wood spirits' combat strength was gathered at Nitrain Fortress, where Barty was fighting. After all, compared to the wood spirits, who had no ability to expand, the humans in the mortal plane were the wood spirits' true enemies. But as the Barty Empire continued to grow stronger, especially with the addition of the dragons and the rise of the Southern Sect, the undead, who lacked top-level combat strength, were actually gradually being suppressed. The Barty Empire was only able to firmly block the undead from advancing north. That was because everyone knew that before the undead emperors truly descended, fighting the undead to the death would be meaningless. There was no limit to the undead in the undead plains. But on the other hand, the Barty Empire was having quite a headache. In the second battlefield, the undead achieved a series of accomplishments. The Death Council and other evil cultists spread like wildfire. The allure of eternal life was not only effective on nobles who feared death, it was also very attractive to commoners who were in pain and despair due to war, poverty, and other reasons. Do you fear death? Do you feel pain for life? Do you feel pain for your lack of power? Join us, and you'll receive a chance to change your fate. The Death Council's believers were probably experts in marketing. Nowadays, it was common to see such advertisements on the streets of every major city in the Barty Empire. It had to be said that the Death Council was quite honest compared to the gods' untruthful preaching. Fear? The undead didn't know fear? Hunger? The undead didn't know hunger? Couldn't find a wife? The undead didn't need a wife? Cough, cough, that last one didn't count. It should be, the person they loved was already dead? Let's change the method and let her live again. In an era of war, the most pitiful were the powerless commoners. When the strong lost their restraints, and when society's peaceful atmosphere was broken, powerlessness became a type of sin. Victims desired the power to take revenge, ambitious people desired the power to improve themselves, and even ordinary commoners desired the power to protect themselves. But obtaining power wasn't so easy. Not to mention the fact that cultivating magic was basically a money-burning endeavor. Even cultivating martial arts required the teachings of a famous teacher and sufficient nutrition. And cultivating the path of the undead required only corpses to be used as raw materials and the bottom line of a normal person. And in an era of war, these two things were probably the least valuable of all. The reason why the Death Council was able to spread itself so quickly was because it had indeed given those who desired power a chance to quickly become powerful. In fact, in some places, commoners who used undead or dark magic to quickly become powerful received the same treatment as other powerful individuals. The path of undead, which had extremely low requirements for talent and wealth, actually began to become mainstream. Of course, it was impossible for Roland to escape responsibility for how things had developed to this point. The Northland's undead did everything they could to whitewash the undead's name and spread propaganda. Undead magic became more and more commonplace, and the fact that the undead and the living coexisted together. The Southern sect also did everything they could to smear the original Holy Light Church's teachings. This was one of the main reasons why the undead viewed the undead as enemies. Of course, there was also the Tark Republic and the Death Council's propaganda. All of these helped to dispel many people's resistance to the undead. On the other hand, with the establishment of the Hades, the new 4 main elemental planes met with great opportunities for development. Ice magic began to mutate, and the ice elemental plane was being constructed. Meanwhile, the power of death was also developing. At any rate, all of this more or less had something to do with Roland. Getting back to the main topic, on the day that the demon wave arrived, the dimensional restrictions on certain exiled families were lifted. The Bardi Empire finally had a chance to get rid of a major threat. Or, it would be more accurate to say that the major threat had been gotten rid of. Is this the taste of home? It's really. The person who sighed was a white-haired boy who had just walked out of a teleportation portal. He looked similar to a human in his infancy, but the moment he arrived in this world, he lowered his head and licked the ground. He then bit off a sturdy stone slab, making the sound of crushed stones being stirred. I'm so disgusted. There's the smell of the living everywhere. The strong aura of life is so close to me. Just what have you all been doing all these years? The white-haired boy spat out all the crushed stones in his mouth and raised his head. His white hair was as dull as fading snow. There was no black in his eyes, only a white cross burning fiercely in them. Even though this was the undead palace, and even though all the guests in the room were powerful undead lords, not a single person dared to directly look at the life-threatening soulfire. Your Majesty's Shupness, your arrival has... A blood tribe prince went up to greet Shupness, but before he could finish, he was interrupted by the impatient ruler of the Death Fog dimension. Where are the others? Don't tell me they're not here yet. The blood tribe prince hurriedly gestured for Shupness to lead the way when he considered the fact that Shupness was infamous for his impatience. No, the Majesties have all arrived. They're all waiting for your arrival. Shupness chuckled upon hearing this. All the undead lords knew that the undead witch emperor of the Death Fog dimension hated waiting and being late. What he loved the most was having others wait for him. The blood tribe prince who was supposed to receive Shupness secretly rejoiced. Fortunately, he had informed the undead witch emperor of the Death Fog dimension that the undead witch emperor was supposed to arrive one day later than the actual gathering time. Shupness, who was impatient and was used to arriving early, wouldn't have to wait for anyone. As the blood tribe prince who was supposed to receive Shupness, the blood tribe prince wouldn't be angered by this hot-tempered undead emperor. Soon, in a small conference room, only one of the 5 seats at the table was empty. As Shupness arrived, the 5 undead emperors at the peak of the power of death gathered together in Asalivis. There was a sleepy old man, a white-haired boy who looked like he was still in elementary school, a white skeleton that was completely indistinguishable from an ordinary skeleton soldier, a young girl who was enjoying a red liquid in small mouthfuls, and a seemingly ordinary human. If I had to find something common about all the undead emperors, it would probably be that they all looked quite ordinary. Chapter 655. When I received the latest report that the Bardi Empire's Rainy Night Fortress was being viciously attacked by the undead army, I wasn't surprised at all. After all, this was within my expectations from the very start. When the demon wave truly arrived, that would mean that the Holy War's preliminary and probing battles would come to an end. What would come next would be a true, direct battle. But when I heard that 5 undead emperors had appeared on the battlefield, everyone sucked in a cold breath. After all, there had only been one undead emperor known to the world for so many years. However, the Yonye calamity from back in the day had directly affected the entire world's population, causing all the undying and leaders of every species to remember this undead emperor's name. The more a high-level existence understood undead magic, the more they would understand what it meant to become an undead emperor. The undead were born with incomplete souls, making it nearly impossible for them to reach the level of level 4. The most critical step would be to gather their own souls into a unique form of light. However, if even their souls were incomplete, it would theoretically be impossible for them to reach the level 4. And yet, there would always be some people capable of making the impossible possible. 5 Yongya-level existences all at once. From a certain standpoint, this wasn't an overestimation, but rather an underestimation. In terms of pure power level on paper, I would be utterly defeated by any undead emperor. That was because I had the shortest amount of experience out of all the undead emperors. I was only a fraction of the other undead emperors. To determine an undead mage's power level, one would need to consider both the undead mage's army and the undead mage's personal combat strength. Even if these ancient undead emperors weren't the rulers of an entire undead plane, they would at least have occupied an entire undead plane. Their undead armies would be countless. If Aso led his army in a direct confrontation, it would be impossible for Roland to win. If conservation hadn't been in a hurry to enter the mortal plane and instead waited for the holy war to begin, Roland would still have been unable to defeat Aso. Actually, even if conservation was by herself, Roland would still have been unable to defeat Aso's army if it weren't for the fact that she was restricted by her personal bug world. Due to the incomplete soul, it was probably the most difficult for the undead to reach the level of level 4. But breaking through to level 4 would mean that the undead would no longer be restricted by nature. In certain aspects, they would surpass the creator goddesses, so it would be impossible for them to not be strong. Roland was an expert at dissecting souls. Conservation had the unique understanding of energy fields in this world. Aso hadn't had a chance to use his expertise yet. However, these undead emperors were foundationally different from ordinary undead lords. They all had miraculous powers capable of turning the impossible into the possible. They did not choose to add fuel to the fire, to gradually put pressure on the human frontline. Instead, they put in all their effort from the very beginning, appearing in the Battle of Nitraine Fortress at the same time. The end result was that the Bardi military suffered a major defeat. The Nitraine Fortress was lost, and the 12 dragons and their dragon knight all died in one go. Currently, there were still several dozen newborn bone dragons hovering in the sky above Nitraine Fortress. The undead emperors still had the temperament of ancient undead lords. They had no habit of treating the living as their own kind. During the battle, they used many incredibly evil biochemical miasma, undead enslavement, and summoning spells. Then, they unhesitatingly used the forbidden spell Undead Calamity right after Nitraine Fortress fell, transforming a large number of civilians and captives into undead. The undead swarmed towards the next battlefield like a tidal wave. This was the undead's true headache-inducing undead tactic. Although the undead hadn't put much thought into this tactic over the past millennia, it was fine as long as it was useful. There really wasn't any good way to deal with such a massive undead sea. Due to a certain undead emperor's interference, the Bardi people's physiques were generally inclined towards negative energy. Not only were they highly suitable for cultivating undead magic, they were also excellent undead resources. Many high-level undead and elite undead troops with intelligence appeared during the Undead Calamity, greatly increasing the undead army's quality. The undead planes were constantly sending reinforcements to the Bardi Empire. Whenever the next fortress fell, it would snowball, and the number of undead would naturally double. This instantly worsened situation shocked the entire Bardi Empire. Not only that, the 5 undead emperors all appeared together in a magnificent formation, causing everyone to tremble in fear. Undead calamities were something that would only increase in number and strength the more they fought, and the more difficult it would be to deal with. When the undead emperors truly gathered enough undead armies, the tremendous number of low-level undead would create a sufficient number of elite undead commanders. A sufficient number of undead would also mean that the undead emperors would have enough cannon fodder and experimental materials. Stronger undead creations would gradually appear, and the foundational undead would also be replaced. As the entire undead army evolved, it would be only natural for the situation to develop to a certain extent and sweep across the entire world. In the first month of the Holy War, The Bardi Empire was about to face its fiercest challenge. However, Bardi's situation wasn't the only one. San Antonio's front lines against the ogres and demons had also suffered tremendous setbacks. However, the ancient ogres' leader, Great Chieftain Merkin, had defeated the Holy Church and San Antonio's allied defensive line. Voodoo spears directly caused the entire city to sink into a light green swamp. The 4-meter-tall troll hero single-handedly destroyed the Holy Church's angel squadron and human rangers. Not a single one of them could stop him. Not only was he able to stand up to thousands by himself, many powerful individuals and countries that had underestimated the trolls were greatly astonished, and they also re-evaluated the troll's combat potential. Modern people might have already forgotten this name, but Merkin had once been a hero of the ancient ogre empire. After the strength he displayed was recorded, the fairies temporarily evaluated him as a 17-star superhuman. That was to say, even if this didn't prove that he was a main god, he was definitely not far from it. The ogres, who had allied themselves with the demons, also revealed their true strength. Unlike the exquisite elven magic, the ogres used their fervent will to summon the power of the elements. Large numbers of corrupted elemental creatures appeared on the battlefield, but the ogres were actually able to fuse with them, transforming into abnormal half-elemental, half-creature monsters that didn't know fatigue, fear death, or pain. They were living meat grinders on the battlefield. It was obvious that the ogres' witchcraft and demonic magic had their own unique aspects that couldn't be understood by the current magical system. The ogres' attack also displayed the ogres' determination and foundational strength. They had the power to challenge the new generation's rulers and reclaim their past glory. However, the ogres' and undead's battles weren't the only battles. In the first month of the demon wave's arrival, all the powerful countries in Ike met their own opponents. Several hundred battles simultaneously broke out, and countless ancient artifacts crawled out from the trash heap of history. Meanwhile, the battles that were already in progress were even more intense. Battle reports arrived like snowflakes. It was as if the entire world had been set ablaze with the flames of war overnight. Then, did the Bardi Empire request reinforcements? Renee was becoming more and more outrageous. She was sending all sorts of government matters to me. Still, I was indeed rather interested in military matters. This would save me the trouble of searching for information myself. No. Hallant is incredibly stubborn. Requesting reinforcements right from the start isn't the style of a major country. Besides, he has a lot of foundational strength. He won't lose so easily. His envoy just arrived. Would you like to have a chat with him? Just thinking about the Bardi Empire's frighteningly large territory and combat potential made it obvious that there would be plenty of time for this battle to take place. There was no need to be in such a hurry. Bardi's neighboring country was the Mage Country, which also had wood spirits. Even if the wood spirits requested reinforcements, they wouldn't come to the far north. Right, there was also the Southern Sect. They would be the true nemesis of the undead once they enter the battlefield. There would be no need for Bardi to request reinforcements at all. However, the Southern Sect had voluntarily sent a battle report and even sent an envoy to inform Bardi. They were acting like a model ally. This wasn't the style of a mega empire that was used to being domineering. They definitely had something they wanted from Bardi. That envoy mentioned the mystical holy light spell you used in the Soliductum. He mentioned it twice. It seemed to be intentional. Holy light spell? He's a priest from the Southern Sect? Yes. I understand now. Forbidden spells were far too powerful. An improved version of the seed of holy light wouldn't be able to escape the eyes and ears of the major empires. The Southern Sect was the original creator of this spell, but it was impossible for them to use such a powerful spell. Right now, this spell was indeed quite effective against the undead. It was time for them to change their method of obtaining assistance from me. It doesn't matter if I give them the spell model, since it's a prototype I obtained from them in the first place. They'll be able to create something similar if they spend some time. However, there are many reasons why my seed of holy light is so powerful. I have the elves' ancient tree of life as the medium for casting the spell, the mage tower's buffs, archmages who were used to casting forbidden spells, and the god of holy light from the land of Hades and his god equipment. Apart from a mage towers and forbidden spell mages, the southern sect probably doesn't have anything else. Although I said that, it was only a convenient favor, so I had no intentions of refusing. As for what the southern sect ended up doing in the end, that didn't really matter to me. At a time like this, favors from major countries were quite valuable. Since the southern sect didn't intend to use official channels to embarrass themselves, the hush money would be quite expensive. I casually wrote down a list and gave it to the southern sect's ambassador. The courier would probably arrive soon, which would be even more convenient than online shopping. By the way, why haven't I seen those 2 women of yours in the past 2 days? I found it quite strange. Previously, whenever I saw Renee, there would always be at least one woman by her side, and she would always look at me strangely. I wasn't quite used to it now that I hadn't seen them for 2 days. Helen's been quite anxious for her country to meet with such great trouble. I'm telling her to go out and relax. As for Ivy, Ivy's been dealt quite a blow by you, so she's probably working overtime in the government office. Dealt a blow? Oh. I paused in surprise for a moment before I understood. Even San Antonio was being attacked by main gods, great gods, and demons. Their food production would definitely be affected. Not only that, they had received several hundred battle reports in just a few days. This directly shattered the southern sect's advisors' optimism about the future. They probably didn't even have the time to regret their decision. Right now, they were all busy looking for ways to collect food. Chapter 656. From a certain standpoint, it wasn't that the entire world was in chaos without any benefits. At the very least, our North Chien caravan's journey was now much smoother. The fastest way to become friends with other people or factions. Everyone's common enemy would just appear. In the past, bringing so many elves in and out of other countries' borders with floating airships as escorts was basically asking for trouble. Even if others didn't think that we were invaders, elven hunters would make things difficult for us along the way, which would be an endless source of trouble for us. It was normal for us to stop here and there. But now, our warnings had become reality. The chaos abyss was attacking us, causing all of human society to feel a mysterious sense of danger and nervousness. It was a small world. It was obviously better to be on good terms with a major North Chien country that didn't have any conflicts of interest with humans, especially one that was a major arms exporter. It was easy to deal with the Yama King, but difficult to deal with the little demons. That was because the Yama King didn't really care about anything. He didn't care about these visitors who came to visit him of their own volition. He didn't strictly supervise his subordinates or set up any rules of discipline. Now that they heard that the leader of the Mist Alliance, Lady Renee, was passing by, not only did they ask for permission to pass through, many domain lords along the way even came to greet them. Some tried to establish connections, some discussed arms deals, and so on. The elves were now able to witness the Mist Alliance's status in human society. Of course, an elf was a tremendous amount of wealth. In some people's eyes, this caravan was like bringing a mountain of gold with it. Even if we used a floating airship knight to escort us, there were still many who felt like they would be able to make a huge fortune. There were always all sorts of people following us. Black-clothed assassins would fly around during the day, and the thieves and spies could play mahjong on the rooftops or in the shadows. We could only helplessly send out black and red dragons to keep up appearances. They would occasionally roar and breathe fire at the sky. Not only that, these legendary beasts were far more convincing than iron airships to these unaffiliated people. That night, there were far fewer onlookers. As for those who protested that it was embarrassing for them to breathe fire at the sky like a monkey show and asked for a higher salary, nobody paid any attention to them. Once we arrived at a sparsely populated area, there would always be people who wanted to try their luck at getting rich overnight. Some large mercenary groups would usually act as mercenaries, but at this time, they would transform into bandits. It could be said that we had witnessed these lowly ambushing techniques. There were some who set up stalls to sell medicinal wine, some who dug up the main road to set up ambushes, and some who took advantage of the night to ambush us. The most interesting of all was that the two domain lords that we had been drinking and chatting with earlier had now become the most valuable captives of all the bandits we defeated. After the interrogation, they found out that he was a repeat offender. It was a taboo to be a lord during the day and a great bandit at night. If news of this got out, who would dare to live in such a territory? It was simply too shameful to be a lord like this. Not only would the lord's reputation take a hit, but even the king would be questioned. And so, we considerately wrote a sincere letter for the sake of these domain lord superiors, promising that we would keep this a secret for the sake of the noble's honor. The king of that country was quite moved, and sent a large amount of treasure and food to express his gratitude. Cough, cough, this was all consensual. How could this be called coercion? It was obviously voluntary work for the army. The entire mortal plane was currently in a special period of time where a storm was brewing. There were endless storms along the way, but since the human kingdoms were beginning to band together to protect each other, and since the escorting airships were quite strong, there weren't any major storms that could capsize the airships. Half a month had passed, and I was now barely able to get out of bed. Although I still didn't have any mana left, at least I didn't have to spend all day doing work. I could swear on my hard work that I had done at least 3 years' worth of work during this half month. So, I decided to think of a way to rest for another 3 years. I didn't intend on interfering with the Mist Alliance's administrative matters. Actually, they were doing quite well. A diligent administrative team with a stable and efficient administrative system would definitely be far more reliable than a genius who only came up with bad ideas. My main focus was still on the war in Ike and the Mist Alliance's preparations for war. After all, I was quite an expert in this area. However, I didn't pay much attention to the numerous battle reports that were enough to bury me alive. After all, it had nothing to do with me, so I could just ignore them. And for a long period of time, the number of battle reports would explosively increase. It would be enough for me to learn a little bit about these things that made me angry, yet helpless. The only thing that attracted my interest, or perhaps the entire mortal plane's attention, was the battle between the Bardi Empire and the undead. 5 undead emperors had appeared together in a grand lineup. Their every action attracted everyone's attention. Everyone was waiting for the fairies' reports and evaluations. Unfortunately, the fairies' final report was rather disappointing. All the undead emperors are rated at least 5 stars. They're just going to fool us like that? The next report I received was far too disappointing. The fairies' information was far too vague. Such an evaluation only meant that the undead emperors were definitely stronger than low gods. However, everyone knew that the undead emperors were even stronger than low gods. So, such an evaluation was basically the same as saying nothing. But when the actual battle reports came out, I knew that I couldn't blame the fairies. I could only blame the slyness of the ancient undead. The undead emperors hadn't displayed any special traits or rare abilities during the battle. All they had done was continuously summon undead in a large area, and then use some normal negative energy undead magic attacks. At their most impressive, they could summon several hundred times more undead than an ordinary undead lord with a wave of their hand. Negative energy attack magic, such as Death's Finger, could be used as meteors to smash cities. Everyone knew that the undead emperors were dangerous because of their special traits. This was their research domain that had reached the limits of the creator goddesses. Obviously, these sly ancient undead wouldn't reveal their trump cards so easily, since the undead emperors were far too ancient, and they often lived in their own territories. The fairies wouldn't be able to find out what the undead emperor's trump cards were by simply looking up information from the past. It was likely that it would take quite some time to find out who the undead emperors were. And considering how much progress the undead emperors had made over the years, even if they had information, it would only be a reference. The fact that the undead emperors had used a sea of undead to flatten Nitrain Fortress without even being serious proved how confident the undead emperors were. At the very least, I personally didn't want to face them at all. Indeed, I wanted to negotiate with the Tark Republic. If we could reach an agreement, it would save me a lot of trouble. Unfortunately, peace would only be valuable after the smoke of war. Until the undead emperors were certain that they wouldn't be able to achieve their goals, negotiations would be meaningless. I closed my notebook, took a deep breath, and closed the window. The chilly air of early winter made me feel energized, but it was rather hurtful for a sick person like me who had just woken up from bed. Keeping a diary was a habit of mine. Not only would it record the past, it would also remind me if I had done something foolish recently and if I needed to make up for it. But right now, the most important goals in my notebook were still nowhere to be found. Complete the gathering of materials for the Holy Sword Dawn. I'm waiting for Bafing's news. Considering the difference in power levels, the success rate isn't high. But why do I feel like he definitely won't fail? Use conservation as a conduit to communicate with the Tark Republic. Attempt to coexist with them. Failed. Complete the Three Kingdoms alliance with Bardi and Ottoman Empire, as well as the trade of weapons and food for the coming year. Completed. However, there was an additional line at the end of this sentence. Considering the effects of the current war, we can't count on them to fulfill their end of the agreement. We can consider asking the Nature faction for help, but it'll be quite troublesome to owe them favors. Complete the reconciliation with the surface dragons with Halen's assistance. Failed. Those stubborn old fools always spit insults at me the moment we meet. Continue to attack the Holy Church's faith in the God of Holy Light and weaken his abilities. Ongoing, but I don't see any signs of him weakening. Help Harloise complete the establishment of the Northland's Elven Empire. Ongoing, but choosing a location is a major problem. Hopefully, it can be decided within 2 years. Complete the opening of the Ice Plain and the establishment of a new Elven alliance. There were several hundred scattered missions. Most likely, every one of them would be considered an epic rank quest. However, among all the missions, there was one that was the most important and troublesome. Investigate Cavendish's goal? This was the only mission that I had 3 question marks on, because I didn't even know where to start investigating. Cavendish's whereabouts were a mystery. All I knew was that he was currently searching for the true Chaos Abyss. If I followed this clue, it might actually help him. I had already asked the fairies, the Mage Country's Truth Symposium, and the Mist Alliance's Intelligence Department to investigate. However, apart from the fairies, I didn't have much hope for anyone else. Even the fairies probably wouldn't be able to find any clues. Revive Cynthia? Not mentioning the grudge between us, I didn't believe that Cavendish would be so uncreative as to revive a demon king to destroy the world, only to be defeated by a hero. That was such an ancient tactic. If he wanted to destroy the world, why didn't he do it himself? Besides, if he destroyed the world, everyone would die together. Who would benefit from it? I felt like those fairy tales were completely illogical. Evolve by devouring? Even if I didn't mention the pitiful success rate, to be honest, this wasn't Carwin's style at all. Carwin's was quite similar to me in certain aspects. He would only trust the power that he obtained bit by bit. Only something that completely belonged to him would be the most authentic. Just thinking about what he wanted to devour and what strange creature would exist in his body in the future that would merge with his flesh and blood made me feel disgusted. At the very least, if Carwin's truly desired to become stronger at all costs, and he was even willing to use the dirty method of devouring to evolve, there would be no need for him to go through so much trouble to find the creator goddesses. Wouldn't it be enough if he directly went to find a main god? Carwin's probably hadn't reached the peak yet. Once all the possibilities were eliminated, even the most ridiculous answer would be the truth. I had a few faint guesses, but I needed information to prove them. Some possibilities made me feel like it wouldn't matter even if I didn't stop Carwin's. However, there was one possibility that made me want to stop him at all costs. I hope that it's not that. Cavendish wouldn't be that insane, would it? Based on your style, isn't that the one that you don't want to see the most? I felt rather helpless as I looked at the silly cat who was yawning next to me. She truly was a golden jinxer. However, I was still rather grateful to her for the past few days. Ever since I used a forbidden spell and had used up all my mana and stamina, she had always stayed by my side to protect me. What made me feel slightly sad was that even though I was so heavily injured, so many people still came to visit me. The truth was that there were still many people who wanted me dead. My outer defenses were capable of dealing with ordinary weaklings, but they were unable to stop top-level, powerful individuals from infiltrating me. Over the past few days, I had chased away nearly a dozen top-level powerful individuals. I had also sensed the murderous gazes of extraordinary individuals and gods more than 10 times. If it wasn't for the fact that the gods of Hades were also protecting us, and that both sides were restraining themselves, a god war would have begun long ago. Only 4 undead emperors had the ability to reach me through various methods. But if it wasn't for Harlois, I probably would have died 4 times already. It was likely that the silly cat was only 1 step away from becoming an undead emperor. All those undead emperors who appeared to be semi-god extraordinary individuals were easily defeated by her. Their corpses were even hung on the main cannons of the battleships as a warning to those who didn't have the skills to come here and die. I couldn't be bothered to ask who had sent them. There were many who wanted me alive, but there were even more who wanted me dead. There were so many that I didn't even need to count. It was obvious that I was in a weakened state after using a forbidden spell, and my whereabouts were so obvious, so those who had grudges against me would naturally seize this opportunity. There were also many who didn't have grudges against me, who wanted to become famous and obtain a bounty on me. Dragons, elves, dwarves, humans, beastmen, and undead. Even if you ask, there's no meaning. With how many species there are, it's likely that the entire world wants you dead. Harlois' words made me recall something. As I was the only forbidden spell mage in the entire world who was still alive, and well, after using multiple forbidden spells, no non-allied country or faction would want the Mist Alliance to have such a powerful killing machine that could be used repeatedly. No, considering the fact that in this day and age, allies were meant to be sold, it was impossible to even count on allies. Since everyone wanted me dead, I couldn't be bothered to guess what they were thinking. At any rate, I received some unexpected rewards, which I considered a rather satisfying unexpected gift. You found a legendary ice element weapon. This was an unexpected, pleasant surprise, but it was also reasonable. What could be more effective than casting an ice element forbidden spell to reach the extreme of the ice element? Chapter 657. Perhaps I had repeated this many times before, but some facts kept reminding us that no matter which world we were in, there was no such thing as true fairness. It would be quite difficult to even get close to fairness. True fairness would forever only exist in theory. In Hei's world, everyone was already used to the law of the jungle, where only the strong were respected. Any species that didn't have a top-level individual would forever become vassals and slaves. The most obvious example would be the silver species' superior elves submitting to the gold species' gold elves, while the bronze species' wild elves and inferior elves were vassals of the superior elves. Humans were an exception. This wasn't recorded in history books, but in the memories of the ancients, humans had once been the vassals of giants, ogres, and elves. However, humans learned magic and martial arts from these species. In this cruel world, before humans truly rose up and became independent, these weak species had never been cowards. Humans' bloodlines were naturally inferior, just like how humans would never be able to fight against giants. Some things were impossible to change. However, humans knew how to use tools. It was unknown which creator had first thought of this, but the appearance of myth-ranked and legend-ranked weapons that combined their own personal paths indeed gave top-level individuals the possibility of surpassing the strongest individuals of other species. The most obvious way to choose one's own combat style and division of labor would be to create combat job classes. In the primordial era of myths and legends, there had never been any division of labor between warriors and mages. Those powerful immemorial creatures would either randomly attack with their physical bodies or instinctively control the elements to attack. This was probably another way of saying that there were no paths in the world to begin with, but the more people that walked, the more paths there would be. The peak of a job class would be to condense one's own path and pass into a tool that only one could use. Yes, human skin wouldn't have as powerful a defensive ability as dragon scales. However, we could hunt down powerful myth-ranked beasts and use their thick skin to create armor and shields that would surpass the defensive capabilities of city walls. Yes, humans' magical senses and affinity for the elements would be incomparable to the elves. However, I could use a special tool as a part of my body and fuse it with the core of an elemental creature or magical creature. This would increase my affinity for the elements in a certain area, or even increase the power of a specific spell. This would make up for my natural lack of spellcasting abilities. Yes, humans would be unable to compete against giants in strength. However, I could create an ogre gauntlet that would increase my strength. Yes, humans are unable to fly and have limited physical strength, but I can make light magic boots. Yes, humans are unable to travel through time. Therefore, we fused the concept of time and created the Sand of Time. Myth-ranked weapons shouldn't be viewed as too mysterious. That was simply an extension of humans' instinct to use tools. It was just that the tools of the strongest individuals would be recognized by the entire world. However, there were obvious advantages and disadvantages to using such a specialized path. Tools had their own characteristics. They were made to make up for their inherent shortcomings, but on the other side of the obvious characteristics was the lack of versatility. You might be able to create a dragon-scale shield, but the areas without a shield would be extremely fragile. That heavy armor was ultimately not a part of your body. The extra weight and discomfort, as well as the skin that was covered, would definitely affect your agility and perception. There was always a loss for every gain. When he decided to use external objects to improve the flaws of his body, it also meant that his body had no room for growth, and the flaws in other areas would become even more obvious. When he decided to use a tool, the tool's usage would also be determined. While the usage of the tool would indeed be improved, there would still be no obvious changes in other areas. But sometimes, combat wouldn't be a simple bucket effect. Strengthening one's advantages and hiding one's weaknesses would be the normal way to obtain victory. You don't need to be stronger than your opponent in every area. Choosing your combat style based on your advantages is the only way to achieve long-term victory. Of course, the simplest way to solve this problem would be to make several more tools if one tool wasn't enough. But when considering how difficult it would be to become a level 4 individual, how difficult it would be to create a myth-ranked weapon, and most importantly, how it would be impossible for a human's bloodline to support multiple myth-ranked weapons, it seemed that it would be impossible for any ordinary powerful individual to become a level 4 individual. For humans who were inherently weak, becoming a level 4 individual wouldn't necessarily be a good thing. For most powerful individuals, choosing their own tools would mean that there would be no chance for them to change their decision. It would be a one-sided deal, and if they made a mistake, that would mean that they were voluntarily limiting their own growth potential. To put more bluntly, this would mean that their game character had become useless, so they would have to reincarnate and start over. Typically, the creation of a myth-ranked weapon would be the culmination of one's entire life's work and experience. Sometimes, if one forcefully broke through to level 4 without sufficient preparation, or casually broke through to level 4 without anyone's guidance, the final product would be impossible to choose from. There were many laughable existences even among level 4 individuals. For example, there was a powerful individual who was skilled in controlling the water element. His myth-ranked weapon was the culmination of his understanding of the natural water cycle. His myth-ranked weapon was an umbrella that would summon a torrential downpour whenever he opened it. Because of this, he was honored by others as the rain god, and he was welcomed by many in drought-stricken areas. However, a water mage of this level would be able to summon a torrential downpour with a casual wave of his hand. This wouldn't improve his combat ability at all. In fact, since the area of effect was far too large, every time he used the umbrella, it would consume a tremendous amount of mana. The moment he used the umbrella, his power level would be much weaker than when he was at myth rank. Although it was quite laughable that he would become weaker after breaking through to level 4, he definitely wasn't the only one. This wasn't simply a matter of making a mistake or being foolish. Sometimes, calamities would descend from the heavens, and there would truly be no helping it. There was once an archmage who was born with a weak body and would cough up blood whenever he cast a spell. He was naturally intelligent and reached gold rank at the age of 12. His research in the domain of time reached the apex, and his myth-ranked weapon was incredibly powerful. It was said that it was capable of directly reversing time. He was basically a miracle creation. However, miracles came with a price. Every time he used this weapon, he would have to pay a price for his life force. Nobody knew how much life force he had to pay, because that archmage only used it once before dying. Overly strong willpower and beliefs could also result in incorrect results. There was once a level 4 Holy Knight leader who desired to have holy light that was as warm as the sun forever accompany him. In the end, he succeeded, but he died of dehydration. This Holy Knight hated darkness far too much, and his desire for eternity was far too strong. He didn't want to be roasted to death every time the sun went down. It was said that this Holy Knight truly had a strong faith and managed to persevere for 3 months before finally becoming dried meat. Overly strong beliefs would affect a level 4 Holy Knight's subconscious choices. It just so happened that a Holy Knight who didn't have a strong faith wouldn't be able to go very far. There were quite a few Holy Knights who made mistakes. Although there weren't many Holy Knights who would roast themselves to death, it was quite common for them to turn themselves into light bulbs for 24 hours. This lasted until the Holy Church finally wrote these ridiculous jokes into their holy scriptures to warn their descendants. The exact opposite would be the undead emperors. Most undead emperors had been born as ancient humans. They had been stuck at the level 4 level for a very long time, but their accumulations wouldn't go to waste. It would also be a good thing for them to think things through before they reached the level 4 level. Once they broke through, their future would be much smoother. Cough, cough, I was getting off topic. In this aspect, I had quite an obvious advantage due to my previous experience as a level 4 Holy Knight. Not only did I have the knowledge to create multiple myth-ranked weapons, I also had a physical body and soul capable of carrying multiple myth-ranked weapons. Compared to ordinary level 4 Holy Knights, I could only be described as extravagant. But no matter how extravagant I was, I couldn't waste it. The biggest difference between me and other level 4 Holy Knights was that while they would try to summarize everything they had learned in their entire lives and use a single myth-ranked weapon to strengthen their advantages, I was able to think about the functionality of my myth-ranked weapon and use multiple myth-ranked weapons to make up for my weaknesses and weaknesses. The Dawn Holy Sword's special characteristic was the Light of Salvation. I had planned for it to be a Chaos Slayer and Holy Light Redeemer. It had 2 forms. Not only could it weaken chaos demons and undead in a large area, but it could also concentrate its holy light on powerful enemies. It would be my most reliable helper in a long battle against the Chaos Abyss. My original Sin Sword, or perhaps it could also be called the 7 Evils of Creation Sword. This sword originated from my strongest research on undead and souls. Although the design and theory for this sword was the first to appear, the materials required were far too difficult to obtain. It would require a tremendous number of souls and undead, making it impossible to predict how long it would take for it to be completed. But the moment it was completed, theoretically speaking, it would be a mega killing weapon that would target all existences with souls. It would be my strongest magic sword, but when considering the materials required, it would also likely be the last myth-ranked weapon to be completed. I still hadn't finished my thoughts on a myth-ranked law weapon, but when considering the power of law's special effects, and the fact that once my original Sin Sword was completed, I really wouldn't need any more powerful melee weapons. It was likely that I would create a weapon that focused more on binding and defense. As for ice, my research in this area was probably the worst. But since my other 3 myth-ranked weapons already had attack, defense, weakening, buff, binding, and so on, I had already figured out what to do with my ice magic sword in terms of functionality. A self-disciplined, or perhaps semi-automatic, magic sword will also be able to surprise my enemies. If I'm lucky, the upper limit of my combat strength will be quite high. Many self-disciplined myth-ranked weapons will attack both friend and foe at the same time, such as that holy light sun that roasted me to death. Other self-disciplined myth-ranked weapons will also make me not know whether to laugh or cry. If you're unlucky, you'll just buff your enemies and make things difficult for yourself. The upper limit is high, but the lower limit is limitless as well. Are you certain? Harlow's advice didn't shake my resolve at all. Since self-disciplined weapons would often cause disasters to both friend and foe alike, perhaps this would actually be quite suitable for me, since I was already used to bad luck. I've decided. Calamity Sword. Northland's Ice Sword. Even if it will only bring misfortune and natural disasters, I feel like I'll be able to survive longer than my enemies when it comes to dodging the Northland's endless ice and snow disasters. Chapter 658. From a certain standpoint, the Northlands was probably the most unsuitable place for humans to live in the entire world. The Northlands only had 2 seasons in a year, spring and winter. In other places, spring could be treated as winter. 1/3 of the year, the Northlands was constantly frozen. The land was barren, and everything was dying. But this was still my homeland. During the day, I could hear the howling of fierce winds. Without any vegetation to obstruct the cold wind, it would be so cold that it would cause people to shiver. And if the cold wind during the day was only ridiculously cold, the wind at night would truly be murderous. If anyone spent the night outside, they wouldn't even need to collect their corpse. They would be directly frozen in ice. But this was still my homeland. Winter wolves, snowmen, and ferocious bears. If these magical beasts were tossed into the forests of any other region in the continent, they would probably be able to dominate the forest. But in the Northlands, these were the most common wild beasts. It was normal to hear hungry beasts roaring in the middle of the night. The most troublesome thing would be the roars of dragons. That usually meant that a group of hungry white dragons had gotten too close to human residences. It would be impossible for new adventurers to survive in such a homeland. Avalanches, hailstorms, blizzards, frosts, droughts, extreme coldness, tornadoes, and snow disasters. Apart from extreme heat and floods, the people who lived in this land were already used to all natural disasters. As time passed, the residents of this land discovered the advantages of this land as if they were finding joy in their suffering. The barren land and icy weather made the greedy nobles unable to endure the harsh conditions here. Compared to the nobles who enjoyed life in the inner regions, the domain lords who chose to live here had the style of the Night Domain lords from their ancestors. They were not only the masters of this territory, but also the protectors of this land's residents. The lack of resources and the dangerous environment in the outside world made the people here used to huddling together for warmth. Meanwhile, the threat of other races and magical beasts made the Northlanders used to using their own hands to protect themselves. This place was full of warriors and outstanding soldiers, and also produced true warriors who understood teamwork and self-sacrifice. The Northlanders had always been viewed as a barbarian race by the entire human society, but they were also a fighting race that did not have powerful bloodlines. In this land, noble conduct and the weight of one's promise were not just empty words, but the innate temperament of a Northlander. That was because in this land of ice and snow, being exiled and isolated was equivalent to death. In the face of the cruel test of nature, lies and cowards would not be able to muddle through every single time. Honor and loyalty were necessary for survival. The true Northlander warriors who stood out in the elimination would become the pillar and protector of their family and fellow countrymen. Cowards and boastful people would eventually die of shame. The first snow of the year is really early. Even though they were lying on the slowly moving battleship, the cold of the northern lands still made the frail patients feel uncomfortable. They rubbed their hands together and spat out white mist. However, that familiar coldness made them feel refreshed for some reason. "Your Highness, this is the 4th snow of the year." The young attendant's words revealed some new information. I was surprised to hear this, as I was quite familiar with this area. Snow usually represented the arrival of winter. Distributing winter rations, organizing winter hunting teams, and other preparation for winter would all need to be completed before winter arrived. If the schedule was messed up, the heavy snow would greatly hinder the construction of various projects. And I had no reason to misremember the time of the winter snow season. Normally, it would take at least 2 weeks for the first snow to arrive. The silly cat jumped onto my shoulder. When the attendants saw her, they all instinctively took half a step back. She had been acting as my bodyguard all this time. Following the deaths of the Level 4 assassins, the names summoning Ominous Black Cat, Yonya's Cat of Death God, and Ominous Shadow had all become famous. Currently, the most popular rumor was that this Black Cat was a divine, sin/demon lord/death god level undead, disguised as a cat alien. Every day, she would devour over 100 souls. Great Snow Mountain. Her words were quite simple, but after a short moment of confusion, I was able to make up for the lack of logic. I asked the attendant, and, as I expected, I learned some facts that confirmed some things. Starting from 5 or 6 years ago, the Northland's winter began arriving earlier and earlier, but ended later and later. The winter also became colder and colder. The ice elemental plane, the Great Snow Mountain, which was filled with ice and snow magical creatures, was currently transforming into its own ice elemental plane. Although it was located in the uninhabited mountains of the Northlands, the ice elemental plane's connection to the ice elemental plane hadn't been broken yet, so the ice elemental plane kept getting colder and colder in the Northlands. From a certain standpoint, this made the Northlands even more difficult to live in. However, with the upcoming major battle, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Demons' greatest weapons were their powerful bodies and abundant magic power. Even without considering the fact that ice naturally countered the fire element, heat would rapidly dissipate in such a low temperature. Demons' powerful bodies and magic power that relied on instincts to fight would actually become a huge source of energy consumption. Mana consumption could be replenished through food. However, if you wanted to hunt in the Northland's winter, you would first need to find prey. And even if you ate all the wild beasts in the mountains, it probably wouldn't even be enough to fill the gaps between the demon stomachs. Perhaps we can make use of this. Seeing the situation, I had some other ideas. Perhaps the Great Snow Mountain magical realm's elemental creatures could participate in constructing the entire Northland's defense line. Or perhaps we could artificially create a natural defense line for the Northlands. However, I would need to consider things a bit more if I wanted to make this a reality. While I was thinking this, we had already entered the Northlands. Meanwhile, the new Northstar fleet's 3 mega airships were beginning to disband. The new Northstar continued heading north towards the Mist Alliance's capital, Definder, which wasn't even in name. The Mizar went to the industrial base in Sluweir for repairs, and the Alcade went to the Shilowa Empire for repairs and personnel replacements. From a certain standpoint, it could be said that a single airship fleet would be built and maintained in different locations. This was the first time in the world that a single airship fleet had been built and maintained in a single location. However, with the Mist Alliance's foundation, it would be quite difficult for a single shipyard to build a single mega airship in the past few years. Not a single base would be able to support such a large airship if they were all piled together. That's right, only half of our new Northstar fleet had returned. That was because the elves were still continuing on their journey. Based on the elves' constant walking speed, even if they didn't encounter any obstacles, it would still take at least 1 year for them to reach the Northlands. We had originally intended to escort the elves all the way. However, our fleet kept slowing down, and the Mist Alliance countries couldn't afford to wait any longer. This was especially true now that the Demon Abyss was making new movements, and the entire world was entering a sensitive period of the Holy War. That was why we left half of our fleet behind to continue escorting the elves while we brought back 3 of our airships. These 3 mega airships didn't return empty-handed. The heavily injured and the Northland's urgently needed special talents were all on these airships. Half of the Elven Empire's higher-ups had also returned. They needed to hurry up and finish the preliminary work, such as choosing a location, constructing a city, driving away the wild beasts, preparing for war, and so on. Even a year might not be enough for them. There shouldn't be any major problems with the elves' fleet. All the official diplomatic notes from the various countries along the way had already been completed. According to our new plan, the new Northstar would be stationed in the Mist Alliance. After the Mizar and Avarice finished their personnel changes and repairs, they would bring food and medicine that the elves urgently lacked back to the Northlands. The other 4 airships would return to the Northlands with the injured and complete their shifts. Afterwards, The elves would have multiple shifts depending on the situation. However, 2 airships would remain on guard over the elves' fleet. This journey would be quite difficult. However, it would be incredibly important for the future Northlands elves. However, with the Mist Alliance's support, this difficult journey would be both a test for the elves, as well as an opportunity for the elves to fuse together. Fusion, or communication and living together, wouldn't only be a fusion within the elven species. It would also be a fusion between the newly born Northlands Elven Empire and the Mist Alliance. It would be a fusion between humans and elves. From a certain standpoint, this calamity wasn't completely without benefits. At the very least, it had torn apart the elves' outdated customs and beliefs, as well as the arrogance and pride of the previous generation's rulers. This would give the elves a new chance to learn about the world. This journey would be quite difficult. The elves would have to pass through half of the human countries in Ike, personally witnessing the lifestyles and culture of the humans that the elves viewed as barbarians. They would have to approach several battle zones and witness the cruel holy wars and heroic warriors. As the elven royal authority returned and the situation in Ike drastically worsened, countless wild elves would voluntarily join this journey. Every day, new information would cause the entire elven species to explode and clash with their beliefs. I was really looking forward to what the elves would obtain, understand, lose, give up, and awaken from this journey. Of course, I had many things to do, so I didn't have the energy to care about the elves' matters. I said, I'm already here, so I won't run away. No matter what, I'm still the former prince of the Mist Kingdom. I should understand my responsibilities and trust me a little. I felt rather helpless. Ever since I regained the ability to move, I had been followed by at least 4 Mist Kingdom royalties attendants, constantly reporting to Renee. It was almost as if they were watching over a fugitive. Please allow us to point out the errors in your words. Your Highness, you're still the prince of the Mist Kingdom. Her Majesty Renee has also promised that the Mist Kingdom royalties' doors will always be open for you. Although my words were quite touching, and my words were quite sincere, and my expression was quite on point, why did you move 1 meter closer to me and even send someone to block the door? Did you not believe me when I told you that I wouldn't run away? I could only helplessly shake my head as I looked at the young attendants' nervous expressions. I gave up on arguing with them. You've already scared 2 of them to the emergency room. That guard captain is so mentally weak that he's about to jump off the ship, and you're saying that you're not going to argue? Tisk, that's because they haven't been properly trained. I'm just helping Renee teach them a lesson. 2 days ago, they followed me too closely, which made me rather displeased. I knew that they had good intentions, but it really wasn't my fault. 2 muscular men followed me even when I went to the bathroom, and I woke up with several muscular men's faces right in front of me. It was just too disgusting. After being disgusted a few times, I decided to play a few pranks. I would suddenly disappear, scream, laugh, and shout that there were assassins. Something worth mentioning was that 2 assassins really did appear when I shouted that there were assassins. So it was because I discovered them. Cough, fine. I admit that these actions were rather childish and boring, but they were quite effective. The effective result was that Renee directly doubled the number of people watching me. She even had 3 shifts, and she would always smile whenever she saw me, making me feel like she was trying to coax an old child. Was I really that childish? TSK, I really didn't intend to run away. Why did no one believe me? Who was the one who left behind such a huge burden in the Mist Alliance for 8 years, and still didn't come back even though the bounty on the Mist Alliance was already one of the top few in the world? Who was the one who had the cheek to write a letter every year asking for a salary from the Mist Alliance government, but never did any work? Who was it? Which bastard was the one who was so shameless as to steal a salary? I'm so envious. I mean shameless. I try to change the topic, but for once, I wasn't spouting nonsense. I truly didn't intend to leave, because there were some things that I truly needed to be done in the Northlands. In the Northlands of the Magic Sword, only this land of ice and snow can give birth to this sword of calamity. Behind me, the room was also completely white. The mist-filled space was even colder than the outside world. The lifelike ice sculptures recorded the desperate situation in the Northlands. My past memories were slowly awakening, but my Sword of the Northlands had only just begun. Chapter 659. The spacious city walls were covered in a thick layer of ice. The city walls have been repeatedly modified and increased in height due to the passage of time. There are towers, ballista holes, winches, ballistae, catapults, and so on. Traces of construction could be seen everywhere. Perhaps it should be called the smell of war. Thanks to the combined efforts of the smiths and mages, the entire city walls have been reinforced by at least 30 meters. The city walls that were over 100 meters tall seemed like they were reaching into the clouds. Just judging from the outer appearance, this was probably the strongest city in the Northlands. Currently, this city wasn't under the threat of war. All its doors were wide open. Even before entering the city, the crowds of people walking about were already quite eye-catching. Orcs hawked their leather goods and prey on the streets, while buying tobacco, liquor, cotton clothes, and other Northland luxury goods without restraint. The undead in black cloaks carefully stayed away from these hot-blooded people and bought those shady and legal goods in the small shops deep in the alleys. In the dark alley, black smoke rose from the furnace in the dwarf shop. No matter what, dwarven weapons were always best-selling items. Outside the shop, the northern barbarians were showing off their martial arts skills in the street, hoping to find an employer. At the same time, they were drooling over the liquor and fine weapons in the shop. When I first arrived in Definder, I thought that I had come to the wrong place. After all, compared to the city that was eternally burning with the flames of war in my memories, this commercial city filled with the sounds of hawkers and shops seemed to be a bit different. Compared to 8 years ago, the number of transactions and business taxes here has increased by 337 times. It wouldn't be wrong to say that it's 100 times more prosperous. Renee's words were filled with pride. I could understand her feelings. The reason for such a ridiculous increase was not only because of how pitiful the population had been in the past, but also because of the hard work of the people of Definder. What could make people feel more proud than seeing their hometown slowly becoming more prosperous? I looked at the map and discovered that just the market area, which was only used for transactions, was already larger than the old Definder City District. I looked at the markings on the map. Most of the shops here were opened by local residents and goblins. Most outsiders were tourists and merchants who came here because of the city's reputation. It would seem that as the Mist Alliance's capital, Definder's increased political status also greatly improved its economic and military status. Definder was quite qualified to be a fortress city. From the very start, it had been chosen based on geography. The Mist Kingdom's many generations of construction had made this city a sturdy fortress facing the north. As long as this place was blocked, neither the Beastmen in the north nor the Demon Abyss in the northeast would be able to pass through. As the Mist Kingdom entered a period of peace with the entire Northlands, Definder's supposed enemies became allies. Definder's original strategic importance greatly decreased. However, this didn't mean that Definder had left the stage of history. It was the opposite. As the Mist Kingdom became more and more important in the new Mist Alliance, the city of Definder also became more and more important. The current Definder was no longer a lone city. There were 7 satellite cities within several hundred kilometers of Definder. Some of these cities were mining and smelting facilities. Some were warehouses for raw materials and food, and some were the Northland's largest trading center for weapons, food, and equipment. Half of these cities were the Mist Kingdom's knight and warrior training centers. Definder and its satellite cities were also the Northland's largest military camp. Every day, merchants and diplomatic envoys from all over the world would travel thousands of kilometers to Definder with various missions. Young knight and heroes would come here with hopes for the future. Various species of the Mist Alliance would come here for various reasons. The flow of people brought prosperity to Definder. The fact that there were so many different species living here meant that Definder's economy and culture would skyrocket. As the Northland's political, cultural, economic, and military center, the more important the Mist Kingdom was, the more important Definder's role would be. Compared to the past, Definder's central city had expanded by at least 4 times. If you counted it as a satellite city, it wouldn't be wrong to say that it had expanded by several dozen times. Definder's many expansions in such a short period of time made the city's streets seem rather crowded and chaotic. But looking at it from a different angle, the fact that there were countless different languages and citizens living here represented endless vitality. Definder had one advantage compared to other commercial cities. This advantage was something that no other city could compare to. This was also the foundational reason why Definder was able to prosper. Holy silver light formed a faint screen in the sky. It was as if an invisible eye was watching over this miraculous city. The Mist Kingdom's guards weren't the only ones patrolling the streets. The law priests and justice knight who wore the symbol of a scale were also the city's protectors. Transactions here were quite special and quick. In fact, outsiders might even think that it was inconceivable or magical. I swear to the God of law and hell that everything I've said in the contract is true. I shall fulfill all the requirements and rules of the contract and deliver the goods to the God of hell within 3 months. I swear to the God of law and Hades that I shall deliver the goods within 1 month after receiving the furs. The barbarians and gnomes simultaneously swore to the God of law and signed their names on the contract. As witnesses, the contract intermediary silently prayed. After a short flash of silver light, this contract was now under the supervision of Womians, the god of contracts. No mortal would ever go against this contract. 8 years ago, when I brought my army back to the Northlands, Womians blessed this city and used a divine forbidden spell to transform it into Womian's holy domain. This was a sinless city with no crimes. All criminals and deceivers would be marked by a red light representing deceit, and the judge and justice knight would appear within 5 minutes. And as Womian's divine concept as the god of contracts improved and improved, guaranteeing contracts became part of his responsibilities as well. A city where there was no crime, no fraud, and all trade contracts would definitely be fulfilled. Perhaps every serious merchant would go crazy over such a city. Not to mention the fact that all the major transactions in the Northlands would be conducted here. Even the transactions between the kingdoms within the continent would be conducted here. Just the commission that the law priests received from the contracts was already an astronomical figure. In fact, many people even suggested to expand the scope of supervising contracts, hoping that Womians would not only supervise commercial contracts, but also the more important diplomatic and military contracts. If this really happened, Womian's reputation would probably reach new heights. But when I thought about it carefully, I realized that this was a trap. Supervising contracts between countries sounded quite impressive, but countries weren't existences with personalities. There were only benefits between countries. As long as there was a need, it would be common for countries to betray their contracts. And if they really did supervise contracts, it would be impossible for the entire country to receive divine punishment for breaking a contract. Those who should betray would still betray. Even if the signatories received divine punishment, the contract would still be broken. In the long run, the gains wouldn't make up for the losses. 1 failure, 2 failures, and more contracts would be broken. Womian's divine concept would also be blasphemed, which would instead cause negative effects. Let's get back to the main topic. The business tax that Renee mentioned was increasing exponentially was at least half due to the taxes on trading contracts. Also, the establishment of a financial exchange for long-distance trading of large commodities and futures made Definder the center of the Northlands financial system. Every year, the National Treasury's income would increase exponentially, and this was under the premise that a tremendous amount of money was spent on military construction. From small transactions like fur trading between hunters and beastmen to large transactions like arms and resources trading between mega empires, the taxes would range from 6% to 30%. Just thinking about it would be an astronomical amount of income. It seemed inconceivable that Definder had gone from a land of bitter poverty to a land of riches in less than 10 years. But in the world of He, where true gods existed, this was the norm. The rise of a new god would bring about the rise of a country and a people. As the first country to have Womians, the god of law, as their national religion, The people of the Mist were currently benefiting from the rise of the Hades gods and Womians. At the very least, it was certain that they would prosper before the gods died. And the gods' attention also brought about another essential factor for prosperity, a sense of security. No matter how profitable a business was, it would be useless if you didn't have a life to spend the money. Nobody was an idiot in this day and age. Just who was behind the Northland's Mist Alliance was already an open secret. The long-term stability of investments and transactions didn't just depend on regular security, it also included the security of domestic politics and policies. In this aspect, the newly born Hades gods were all veteran gods. The goddess of wealth, the god of fate, the moon goddess, and the god of death were all neutral gods with good reputations. And Womians represented law and fairness, which was what merchants desired the most. As for the most important trade routes and travel safety, the Northland's airships had already opened up several regular trade routes between cities on the continent, including the Bardi Empire's capital, Definder, and the Ottoman Empire's capital, Definder. Although the transport fees were indeed quite high, compared to the potential of encountering bandits, magical beasts, and war on land, the expected additional costs weren't much at all. At worst, they could just transfer the costs onto the goods, which was far better than losing both the people and the goods. Safety, speed, stability, and inconceivably fair contracts. Thanks to so many factors, Definder was faintly on the verge of becoming the commercial capital of Ike. A remote Northland city was now on the path of commerce, and it even had the potential to become a mega commercial city. I really didn't know how to evaluate this. The Northland's prosperity also brought wealth to the Mist people and even all Northlanders. The Northlands wasn't truly empty. A complete Northland's Winterwolf's pelt would only be worth 50 gold coins in the Northlands, but it could be sold for thousands of gold coins in the center of the continent. It wasn't that nobody had ever thought about these Northland specialties. It was just that the high transport costs and the dangers of the trade routes made most hunters rather take the safe 50 gold coins. Firearms, various handicraft from other species, magical beast materials, alchemy products, engineering products, and so on were the most commonly traded items here. They were also the best-selling items. As for me, even though I sighed in admiration, I still had to wear a thick white cape. I didn't dare to take it off even when I was eating or drinking. After all, no matter how thick-skinned I was, I still couldn't take it off when I saw all the statues of myself everywhere. Not only that, I also couldn't help but see people praying to my statues in gratitude, especially, it's one thing for you to bless me with a promotion and wealth. I've already tolerated the obvious discrimination of you worshipping Carwins instead of me. But what's the big deal with you worshipping me instead of me? If you want to worship someone, you should worship Beifeng's portrait. Don't mention it. There really are people who worship Beifeng's statue. However, it's an evil sect that's forbidden by the continent's laws. They call themselves the Brotherhood of Truth with boundless love. I don't want to know it all. While gagging Harlow-East's mouth, I recalled the person who was still in the chaos abyss. Not long ago, he had sent me a letter saying that it would take some time to deal with that arrogant birdman. He told me to be patient. At that time, I really wanted to ask him, who told you to deal with that birdman? I only want myth-rank materials. I only want materials. Please don't make a big deal out of this. Everyone in the world will thank you. However, I felt that no matter what I said, it would be useless. I shouldn't suspect the person I used, so I decided to just let him be. Yep, I definitely wasn't intending to cut ties with that bastard right after I obtained the materials, and then toss him out for bounty. Was I such a heartless person who would burn bridges after crossing the river? You still have the face to say that? Amelia, you were so loyal back in the day. Do you still remember how many bridges you destroyed? But for the sake of world peace, it's best to destroy that bridge as soon as possible. The entire world will thank you. While I was still idly chatting and drinking tea, something major had happened over at Renee's side. The Sohn Dukedom and Feldis Kingdom are requesting to join the Mist Alliance? When did this happen? Why are they doing this?